Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Psychology, 4th edition. Narrated by Omar Mohsen Ibrahim Fouad. The time now is 10:12 p.m. The date today is Monday, June 8th, 2026. Chapter 5, Learning. Chapter Outline and Learning Objectives. An Introduction to Learning. LO1, Define Learning, Classical Conditioning. LO2, Explain what Pavlov's studies teach us about classical conditioning. LO3, Identify the differences between the US, UR, CS, and CR. LO4, Recognize and give examples of stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. LO5, Summarize how classical conditioning is dependent on the biology of the organism. LO6, Describe the Little Albert study and explain how fear can be learned. Operant conditioning. LO7, Describe Thorndike's law of effect. LO8, Explain how positive and negative reinforcement differ. LO9, Distinguish between primary and secondary reinforcers. LO10, Explain shaping and the method of successive approximations. LO11, Describe continuous reinforcement and partial reinforcement. LO12, Name the schedules of reinforcement and give examples of each. LO13, Explain how punishment differs from negative reinforcement. Observational learning and cognition. LO14, Summarize what Bandura's classic Bobo doll study teaches us about learning. LO15, Describe latent learning and explain how cognition is involved in learning. An Introduction to Learning. Before he was the dog whisperer. December 23rd, 1990, Cesar Millan had made up his mind. It was time to leave Mexico and start a new life in America. He was 21 years old, spoke no English, and had exactly $100 in his pocket. Since the age of 13, Cesar had dreamed of becoming the greatest dog trainer in the world. Now he was ready to pursue that goal, even if it meant saying goodbye to everything he knew and cherished: his family, his homeland, and his culture. Milan and Peltier, 2006. No dream is too big. Young Cesar Milan works with a dog on a treadmill early on. Cesar knew he wanted to devote his life to dogs. He remembers himself as a 13-year-old asking his mother, "Mom, you think I can be the best dog trainer in the world?" She responded, "You can do whatever you want." NPR, 2014. From his home in Mazatlan, Cesar traveled to the border city From his home in Mazatlan, Cesar traveled to the border city of Tijuana, where he met a human smuggler who said he would get him into the United States for a fee of, you guessed it, $100. Trudging over muddy terrain, darting across a busy freeway, and hiding in a frigid trench of water, Cesar stuck with the smuggler. When he finally reached San Diego, he was dripping wet, filthy, thirsty, and hungry. But, as Cesar recalls in his book, Caesar's Way, "I was the happiest man in the world." Milan and Peltier, 2006, page 39. For more than a month, Cesar slept under a freeway and lived on hot dogs from 7-Eleven. Partisan Pictures, 2012. He didn't have a home, but he did have a purpose. "I never felt lost," Cesar recalls. "I always knew what I wanted." Cesar got a job at a pet grooming parlor in San Diego and eventually moved to Los Angeles. where he worked as a kennel boy, a limousine washer, and a self-employed dog trainer. His dog training business was based in Inglewood, a city just south of Los Angeles, with a strong gang presence and many dogs trained to protect and fight. Fine 2013, Lopez 2012, Milan and Peltier 2006. Capable of pacifying even the fiercest of dogs, Caesar could be seen strolling through the city with a pack of Rottweilers and pit bulls. Off leash, Milan ND. Word spread about the Mexican guy who has a magical way with dogs. Milan and Peltier 2006, page 50. And Caesar accumulated more and more clients. The Los Angeles Times got wind of Caesar's work and profiled him in 2002, sparking the interest of several television producers. Levine, 2002. Dog's best friend, young Caesar walks a pack of large and powerful dogs. Caesar doesn't train dogs, he trains people. I'm training humans to understand how dogs react, how dogs behave, what is their communication, and what makes them happy, Caesar explains. It's all about bringing balance to dogs' lives and promoting more fulfilling relationships between dogs and their owners. Fast forward to 2024, Cesar Millan is now a U.S. citizen and perhaps the most famous dog trainer on the planet. His resume includes 9 seasons of Emmy-nominated reality television series Dog Whisperer with Cesar Millan, broadcast in more than 100 countries, along with other TV series such as Caesar 9/11 and Cesar Millan. Caesar 911 and Cesar Millan. Better Human, Better Dog. A better-selling author, Caesar travels the world giving seminars in auditoriums packed with thousands of eager listeners. Fans flood his website with comments, some of them desperate. Hey Caesar, I really need help. I have a 10-month-old pit mix. Others adoring, Dear Caesar, keep doing what you're doing. You've got a believer in me, and millions of others, Milan ND. How do you explain Caesar's rise from poverty to superstardom? Clearly he is hardworking, motivated, and has an innate gift for understanding dogs. But Caesar's life and the lives of countless dogs and their owners have also been shaped by learning. Note, unless otherwise specified, quotations attributed to Caesar Milan are personal communications. Video profile, Caesar in his own words. What is learning? LO1 define learning. Psychologists define learning as a relatively enduring change in behavior or thinking that results from our experiences. These modifications of behavior and thinking are sometimes but not always permanent. Studies suggest that learning can begin before we are even born. Fetuses can hear voices and learn basic speech sounds from inside the womb, according to Lang et al. 2020. This becomes apparent immediately following birth when they are able to discriminate among vowel sounds and distinguish different ways of speaking, according to Hayden et al. 2020 and Moon et al. 2013, as well as Partanen et al. 2013. Learning occurs every day and may continue until our dying breath. Underlying this process are changes in the brain, including alterations to individual neurons and their networks. Although learning has a huge impact on who we are and how we act, it is not responsible for all changes in behavior and thinking. For example, infants begin holding their heads up at about 3 to 4 months, Medline plus ND. This results from the development of neck muscles, which is a normal part of maturation, not learning. Connections. In the biology and behavior chapter, we discuss some of the brain processes involved in learning. For example, dopamine activity plays an important role in learning through rewards. Neurogenesis, the generation of new neurons, is also thought to be associated with learning. The ability to learn is not unique to humans. Dogs can learn to do backflips and jump rope, according to Tomini 2019. And crows can be trained to drop pebbles into tubes of water, according to Hennefield et al. 2018. Female elk are so good at learning to elude people with rifles and bows. Female elk are so good at learning to elude people with rifles and bows that they are almost invulnerable to human hunters after reaching 9 or 10 years of age, according to Thurfgel et al. 2017, page 1. One basic form of learning is habituation. Habituation is evident when an organism reduces its response to a recurring stimulus, according to Hall and Rodriguez 2020. A stimulus is an event or object that generally leads to a change in behavior. Initially, an animal might respond to a stimulus, but that response may diminish with repeated exposures, assuming the stimulus is not threatening. For example, when 3-day-old chicks are exposed to a loud sound, they automatically freeze. But if the loud sound is repeated, even just 5 times, the newborn chicks become habituated to it and carry on with what they were doing, according to Ciandetti and Tirado 2017. Essentially, they learn about the stimulus and become less responsive to it. This type of learning is apparent in a wide range of living beings, from chickens to humans to sea slugs. Connections. In the sensation and perception chapter, we discuss sensory adaptation, the process by which our sensory receptors become less sensitive to constant stimuli. Habituation refers to changes in behavior. If we are repeatedly exposed to a stimulus, we become less responsive to it. Becoming habituated to sensory input keeps us alert to changes in the environment. Researchers have used a variety of animals to study learning. The history of psychology is full of stories about scientists who began studying animal biology, but then switched their focus to animal behavior as unexpected events unfolded in the laboratory. These scientists were often excited to see the connections between biology and experience that became evident as they explored the principles of learning. Animals can be excellent models for studying and understanding human behavior, including learning. Conducting animal research sidesteps many of the ethical dilemmas that arise with human research. It It's generally considered okay to keep rats, cats, and birds in cages to ensure control over experimental variables, as long as they are otherwise treated humanely. But locking up people in laboratories would obviously be unacceptable. This chapter focuses on three major types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. As you make your way through the pages discussing each, you will begin to realize that learning is very much about creating associations. Through classical conditioning, we associate two different stimuli. For example, the sound of a buzzer and the arrival of food. In operant conditioning, we make connections between our behaviors and their consequences. For example, through rewards and punishments. With observational learning, we learn by watching and imitating other people, establishing a closer link between our behavior and the behavior of others. Learning can occur in predictable or unexpected ways. It allows us to grow and change, and it is a key to achieving goals. Let's explore how learning has shaped the life and work of Cesar Millan. Show what you know. Question number 1. Learning is often described as the creation of associations. For example, associations between behaviors and their consequences. List some associations you have made this week. Answers will vary. Learning that your tongue will get burned if you put your coffee in the microwave for too long. Studying hard for a test after getting a good score on the last test you studied for. Question number 2. Learning is a relatively enduring change in blank that results from our blank. The answer is behavior or thinking experiences. Learning is a relatively enduring change in behavior or thinking that results from our experiences. Classical conditioning. Patriots with a problem. Every year around July 4th, animal shelters around the country report a surge in the number of runaway dogs and other pets. Santa Cruz 2020. The banging and popping of fireworks are so terrifying to some dogs they flee their homes to escape the sounds. A dog that fears fireworks or thunder is nothing out of the ordinary. But what if the animal went into panic mode every time they heard the beep of a microwave, cell phone, or elevator? This was the sad reality for Gavin, a sweet Labrador retriever who had worked as a bomb-sniffing dog for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF. Serving his country. Special Agent L.A. Bykowski works with Gavin in an explosives detecting exercise. During his 5 years with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, Gavin helped ensure the safety of people attending Super Bowls and NASCAR races. Then he went on a mission in Iraq, where his problems with noises seemed to begin. Milan and Peltier, 2010. When Caesar first met Gavin, the yellow lab had already retired from the ATF, but he couldn't relax and enjoy his golden years because he was so traumatized by events from the past. While on a tour in the Iraq War, Gavin had witnessed several loud explosions. Whenever an explosion occurred, he quivered and shook, but then was able to carry on with his duties. According to his handler, Special Agent L.A. Bykowski, Milan and Peltier, 2010, page 58. Gavin may have been able to hold it together in Iraq, but the experience had a profound impact on him. Shortly after returning to his home in Florida, Gavin lived through 2 consecutive hurricanes, Milan and Peltier, 2010, which just took him through the roof. According to Caesar, as a result of these experiences, Gavin became hypersensitive to many different sounds. Any beeping noise would trigger his fear response. The sound of a voicemail notification might cause uncontrollable shaking. How did Gavin come to associate harmless everyday sounds with danger? And what did Caesar do to rehabilitate him? To answer these questions, we need to travel back in time and visit the laboratory of an aspiring Russian scientist, Ivan Pavlov. LO2. Explain what Pavlov's studies teach us about classical conditioning. The son of a village priest, Ivan Pavlov had planned to devote his life to the church. He changed his mind at a young age, however, due to a combination of the changing political times in Russia and the readings that challenged his worldview. Todd's 2014. His primary interest was physiology, a branch of biology that investigates the physical and chemical mechanisms underlying life's processes. Although he won a Nobel Prize in 1904 for his research on the physiology of digestion, Pavlov's most enduring legacy was his trailblazing research on learning. Fancher and Rutherford, 2012. Pavlov spent the 1890s studying the digestive system of dogs at Russia's Imperial Institute of Experimental Medicine. Todd's 2014, Watson 1968. His treatment of the dogs was inhumane and cruel, but this darker and more complex side of his research has been somewhat ignored. Adams 2020, page 127. However, his findings did have a transformative effect on the field of psychology, so it is important to cover them in introductory courses. Many of Pavlov's early experiments involved measuring how much dogs salivate in response to food. Initially, the dogs salivated as expected, but as the experiment progressed, they began salivating in response to other stimuli as well. After repeated trials with an assistant, giving food and then measuring saliva output, Pavlov realized that instead of salivating the moment food was served, the dogs began to salivate at the mere sight or sound of the lab assistant arriving to feed them. The assistant's footsteps, for example, might act like a trigger stimulus for the dogs to start salivating response. Pavlov realized that the dog's psyche or personality and their thoughts about food were interfering with the collection of objective data on their Pavlov realized that the dog's psyche or personality and their thoughts about food were interfering with the collection of objective data on their digestion, according to Todd's 2014, page 158. In other words, the dog's psychological activities were affecting their physiology, making it difficult for the researchers to study digestion as an isolated phenomenon. Pavlov had discovered that associations developed through a process of learning we now call conditioning. The dogs were associating the sound of footsteps or the sight of the bowl with the arrival of food. They had been conditioned to link certain sights and sounds with eating. Intrigued by his discovery, Pavlov began to shift the focus of his research and investigate the dog's salivation, which he termed psychic secretions. In such scenarios, as well as other dog behaviors, Adams 2020, June 1st, Fancher and Rutherford 2012, Todd's 2014. Connections. In Chapter 1, we discuss the ethical guidelines psychologists follow when conducting research on living creatures. These guidelines encourage psychologists to do no harm and safeguard the welfare of living research subjects, be they humans. These guidelines encourage psychologists to do no harm and safeguard the welfare of living research subjects, be they humans, chimpanzees, cats, mice, dogs, or any living thing. Pavlov's massive laboratory, which employed some 100 lab assistants, was far from an exemplar of ethical treatment. Many dogs died and suffered under Pavlov's oversight, and he displayed little concern for their well-being, according to Adams 2020 and Todd's 2014. Connections. A dog naturally begins to salivate when exposed to the smell of food, even before tasting it. This is an involuntary response of the autonomic nervous system, a branch of the nervous system described in the biology and behavior chapter. A dog does not normally salivate at the sound of footsteps, however. This response is a learned behavior, as the dog begins to salivate without tasting or smelling food. Here comes the puff. If you've ever had a visual exam, you remember the eye doctor giving you an air puff test to check the pressure inside your eye. The sudden puff of air hitting the eye causes you to blink reflexively. If you have taken the test before, you may blink in anticipation before the air puff even reaches your eye. Through classical conditioning, you have learned to associate the stimuli associated with the procedure with the sensation of the air puff. Mouth-watering science. Pavlov followed up on his observations about psychic secretions with numerous studies starting in the early 1900s, examining the link between stimulus, for example the sound of human footsteps, and response, how much the dog salivates. The type of behavior Pavlov was studying, salivating, is involuntary or reflexive. Pavlov, 1906, the connection between food and salivating is innate and universal, occurs in all members of the species, whereas the link between the sound of footsteps and salivating is learned. Learning has occurred whenever a new non-universal link between stimulus, footsteps, and responsive salivation is established. Many of Pavlov's studies had the same basic format. Infographic 5.1. Prior to the experiment, the dog had a tube surgically inserted into its cheek, so researchers could determine exactly how much saliva it was producing. Once the dog had recovered from the surgery, it was placed alone in a soundproof room and outfitted with equipment to keep it from moving around. Because Pavlov was interested in exploring the link between a stimulus and the dog's response, he had to pick a stimulus that was more controlled than the sound of someone walking into a room. Pavlov used a variety of stimuli, including flashing lights and sounds produced by metronomes and buzzers, which under normal circumstances have nothing to do with food or salivation. In other words, they are neutral stimuli in relation to feeding and responses to food. Connections. In Chapter 1, we discussed the importance of control in the experimental method. If Pavlov were to use the sound of footsteps as his stimulus, he would need to control the number of steps taken and the type of shoes worn to ensure the sound was identical across trials. Otherwise, he would be introducing extraneous variables or characteristics that interfere with the research outcome, making it difficult to determine what caused the dog to salivate. On numerous occasions during an experimental trial, Pavlov and his assistants presented a dog with a chosen stimulus, the sound of a buzzer, for instance, and then moments later gave the dog a piece of meat. Each time the buzzer was sounded, the assistant would wait a couple of seconds and then offer the dog meat. All the while, its drops of saliva were being measured. After repeated pairings, the dog began to link the buzzer with the meat. It would salivate in response to the sound alone, with no meat present, evidence that learning had occurred. The dog had learned to associate the sound with food. Remember, we call this type of learning conditioning. What do you need to know? LO3, identify the differences between the US, UR, CS, and CR. Now that you know Pavlov's basic research procedure, it is important to learn the specific terminology psychologists use to describe what is happening. Infographic 5.1. Before the experiment begins, the sound of the buzzer is a neutral stimulus, NS, something in the environment that does not normally cause a relevant automatic response. In this case, the automatic response is salivation. Dogs do not normally salivate when they hear a buzzer, but through experience they learn to link this neutral stimulus, the buzzer sound, with another stimulus, food, that normally prompts salivation. This type of learning is called classical conditioning, and it is evident when an originally neutral stimulus, NS, triggers an involuntary response such as salivation, eye blinks, and other types of reflexive behaviors, US, UR, CS, and CR. At the start of a trial, before a dog is conditioned or has learned anything about the neutral stimulus, NS, it salivates when it smells or receives food, in this case, meat. The meat is considered an unconditioned stimulus, US, because it triggers an automatic response. Salivating in response to food is an unconditioned response, UR, because it doesn't require any learning. The dog just does it involuntarily. To reiterate, the smell or taste of meat, US, elicits the automatic response of salivation, UR. After conditioning has occurred, the dog responds to the buzzer almost as if it were food. The buzzer, previously a neutral stimulus, NS, has now become a conditioned stimulus, CS, because it prompts the dog to salivate. When salivation occurs in response to the buzzer, it is a learned behavior, and thus we call it a conditioned response, CR. If you're trying to figure out the proper label for the response, think about what it If you're trying to figure out the proper label for the response, think about what caused it. What is the food or the buzzer? Knowing this will help you determine whether it is conditioned, learned, or unconditioned, not learned. The acquisition phase, the pairings of the neutral stimulus, the buzzer, with the unconditioned stimulus, meat, occur during the initial learning phase called acquisition. Some points to remember. The meat is always an unconditioned stimulus, US. The dog never has to learn how to respond to it. The dog's salivating is initially an unconditioned response, UR, to the meat, but eventually becomes a conditioned response, CR, as well. It occurs when the buzzer is sounded without the sight or smell of meat. The unconditioned stimulus, US, is always different from the unconditioned stimulus, CS. The US automatically triggers the response, while the CS elicits a response that has been learned by the organism. Pavlov's work paved the way for a new generation of psychologists who considered behavior to be a topic of objective scientific study. Pavlov's work paved the way for a new generation of psychologists who considered behavior to be a topic of objective scientific study. Like many scientists who would follow, he focused on the objective recording of measurable behaviors, in this case counting the exact number of saliva drops produced by the dogs. His work transformed our understanding of learning and our approach to psychological research. Connections. In Chapter 1, we described the scientific method and its dependence on objective observation. This approach requires us to observe and record without letting personal opinion or expectations interfere. We are all prone to biases, but the scientific method helps minimize their effects. Pavlov was among the first to insist that behavior be studied objectively. Infographic 5.1, Learning Through Classical Conditioning. During his experiments with dogs, Ivan Pavlov noticed them salivating before food was even presented. Somehow the dogs had learned to associate the lab assistant's approaching footsteps with eating. This observation led to Pavlov's discovery of classical conditioning, in which we learn to associate a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus that produces an automatic natural response. This crucial stage of this process involves repeated pairings of the two stimuli. Pavlov's experiment before conditioning: dog salivates automatically when food is presented. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, salivates. Buzzer means nothing to dog, so there is no response. Neutral stimulus, buzzer sound, no response. During conditioning, in the process of conditioning, buzzer is repeatedly sounded right before the dog receives food. Over time, the dog learns that buzzer signals arrival of food. Over time, the dog learns that the buzzer signals the arrival of food. Neutral stimulus, buzzer sound, plus unconditioned stimulus equals unconditioned response, salivates. Repeated over time. After conditioning, dog has now learned to associate buzzer with food and will begin salivating when buzzer sounds. Conditioned stimulus, buzzer sounds. Conditioned response, salivates. Have you been conditioned? Before conditioning, the McDonald's Golden Arches sign is a neutral stimulus. Before conditioning, there was no response. McDonald's French fries, seeing McDonald's French fries, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, mouth waters. During conditioning, neutral stimulus plus unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned response, mouth waters, repeated over time. After conditioning, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, mouth waters. Classical conditioning is an involuntary form of learning that happens every day. Does your mouth water when you see the McDonald's Golden Arches? Just like Pavlov's dogs, we learn through repeated pairings to associate neutral stimuli, the Golden Arches with food, French fries. Once this association is formed, the sight of the Golden Arches can be enough to get your mouth watering. Extended description for infographic 5.1, Learning Through Classical Conditioning. The introductory text reads, during his experiments with dogs, Ivan Pavlov noticed them salivating before food was even presented. Somehow the dogs had learned to associate the lab assistant's approaching footsteps with eating. This observation led to Pavlov's discovery of classical conditioning, in which we learn to associate a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus that produces an automatic natural response. The crucial stage of this process involves repeated pairings of the two stimuli. An accompanying photo shows Ivan Petrovich Pavlov observing a dog on which he conducted his behaviorist experiments. This infographic shows two panels. The first panel, titled Pavlov's Experiment, shows three phases, namely before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. The information presented is as follows. Before conditioning has two parts. The first part shows a dog salivating in front of a food bowl. The food bowl is labeled unconditioned stimulus, and it points to the drooling dog, which is labeled unconditioned response, salivates. Text reads, dog salivates automatically when food is presented. The second part shows a buzzer labeled neutral stimulus, buzzer sound, and a dog showing no response. A thought bubble corresponds to the dog, symbolizing no response. Text reads, buzzer means nothing to dog, so there is no response. During conditioning, a buzzer labeled neutral stimulus, buzzer sound, plus a bowl of food labeled unconditioned stimulus points to a drooling dog labeled unconditioned response. Salivates. This process is repeated 4 times. Text reads, in the process of conditioning, buzzer is repeatedly sounded right before dog receives food. Over time, dog learns that buzzer signals arrival of food. After conditioning, a buzzer labeled conditioned stimulus, buzzer sound, points to a drooling dog labeled conditioned response, salivates. Text reads, dog has now learned to associate buzzer with food and will begin salivating when buzzer sounds. The second panel, titled You Have Been Conditioned, depicts Human conditioning in three phases, namely before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. Before conditioning has two parts. The first part shows a McDonald's logo labeled neutral stimulus and an outline of a person's head, accompanied by a no response thought bubble. The second part shows French fries labeled unconditioned stimulus, pointing to an outline of a person's head labeled unconditioned response. Mouth waters with watering mouth. During conditioning, a McDonald's logo labeled neutral stimulus plus a pack of French fries labeled unconditional stimulus points to an outline of a person's head with a watering mouth labeled unconditioned response. Mouth waters. An icon of a stopwatch indicates that this step is repeated over time. After conditioning, a McDonald's logo labeled conditioned stimulus points to an outline of a person's head with watering mouth labeled conditioned response. Mouth waters. Text reads, classical conditioning is an involuntary form of learning that happens every day. Does your mouth water when you see the McDonald's golden arches? Just like Pavlov's dogs, we learn through repeated pairings to associate neutral stimuli, the golden arches, with food, French fries. Once this association is formed, the sight of the golden arches can be enough to get our mouths watering. Nuts and bolts of classical conditioning. We have discussed classical conditioning in Pavlov's dogs, defining terms along the way. Now it's time to take our learning about learning to the next level and examine some of the principles guiding the process. LO4. Recognize and give examples of stimulus, generalization, and stimulus discrimination. Generalization and discrimination. What would happen if a dog in one of Pavlov's experiments heard a sound with slightly different qualities? For example, suppose the dog was conditioned to salivate in response to the sound of a ticking metronome. Would the dog still salivate if presented with a metronome that ticked faster or slower than the original? Pavlov, 1927 through 1960, asked the same question and found that a stimulus similar to the conditioned stimulus CS did indeed cause the dogs to salivate. This is an example of stimulus generalization. Once an association is forged between a conditioned stimulus CS and a conditioned response CR, the learner often responds to similar stimuli as if they were the original CS. When Pavlov's dogs learned to salivate in response to a metronome ticking at 90 beats per minute, they also salivated when the metronome ticked a little more quickly, 100 beats per minute, or slowly, 80 beats per minute. Hawthor-Sal, 2004. Their response was generalized to metronome speeds ranging from 80 to 100 beats per minute. Perhaps you have been classically conditioned to salivate at the sight of a tall glass of lemonade. Stimulus generalization predicts you would now salivate when seeing a shorter glass of lemonade or even a mug if you knew it contained your favorite drink. What would happen if Pavlov's dogs were presented with two stimuli that differed significantly? Let's say the dogs have learned to associate the meat with a high-pitched sound. They salivate whenever they hear it. Expose these same dogs to lower-pitched sounds, and they may not salivate. If so, they are demonstrating stimulus discrimination, the ability to distinguish between a particular conditioned stimulus, CS, and other stimuli sufficiently different from it. Someone who's been stung by a bee might only have an involuntary fear response to the sight of bees and not flies, because they have learned to discriminate among various flying insects. They have only been conditioned to fear bees. Connections. In the sensation and perception chapter, we introduced the concept of a difference threshold, the minimum difference between two stimuli, noticed 50% of the time. Here we see that difference thresholds can play a role in stimulus discrimination. The difference between the conditioned stimulus and the comparison stimuli must be greater than the difference threshold for stimulus discrimination to occur. Extinction. Once the dogs in a classical conditioning experiment associate the buzzer sound with meat, can they ever listen to the sound without salivating? The answer is yes. If they are repeatedly exposed to the buzzer without the meat, present the conditioned stimulus CS without the unconditioned stimulus US over and over, and the association may fade. The conditioned response CR decreases and eventually disappears in a process called extinction. In general, if dogs are repeatedly exposed to a conditioned stimulus, for example, a metronome or buzzer, without any tasty treats to follow, they produce progressively less saliva in response to the stimulus and eventually none at all, according to Watson, 1968. Spontaneous recovery. But take note, even with extinction, the connection is not necessarily gone forever. After conditioning a dog to associate the sound of a buzzer with meat, Pavlov, 1927, 1960, repeatedly sounded the buzzer without presenting meat, and the association was eventually extinguished. The dog no longer salivated in response to the sound. However, 2 hours following this extinction, Pavlov presented the sound again, and the dog salivated. This reappearance of the conditioned response CR following its extinction is called spontaneous recovery. With the presentation of a conditioned stimulus CS after a period of rest, the conditioned response CR reappears. The dog had not forgotten the association when the pairing was extinguished. Rather, the conditioned response CR was suppressed when the dog was not being exposed to the unconditioned stimulus US. The link between the sound and the food had remained, simply simmering beneath the surface. Let's return to that tall, refreshing glass of lemonade. A summer drink you may not consume for 9 months out of the year. Your conditioned response CR of salivating may be suppressed by extinction from September to the end of May when you see the unused lemonade glass in your cupboard. However, when June rolls around, marking the return of lemonade season, spontaneous recovery may occur. You find yourself salivating at the sight of that lemonade glass again. You find yourself salivating at the sight of that lemonade glass again, the conditioned stimulus. Office pranks. In season 3 of NBC's The Office, Jim, played by John Krasinski on the right, plays a classical conditioning trick on his coworker Dwight, played by Rainn Wilson on the left. Every time Jim's computer makes the reboot sound, Jim hands Dwight an Altoids breath mint. After several pairings of the reboot sound and the mint, Dwight automatically reaches out his hand in anticipation of the mint. "What are you doing?" asks Jim. Looking confused, Dwight replies, "My mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden." According to Williams and Whittingham, 2007, 53 seconds to 1 minute and 3 seconds. Higher order conditioning. Is it possible to add another layer to the conditioning process? Absolutely. Suppose the Suppose the buzzer sound has become a conditioned stimulus, CS, for the dog. Now the researcher adds a new neutral stimulus, NS, such as a flashing light. Every time the dog hears the buzzer, after pairing the buzzer and the flashing light without the meat anywhere in sight or smell, the light becomes associated with the sound, and the dog will begin to salivate in response to seeing the light alone. This is called higher order conditioning, figure 5.1, with repeated pairings of the conditioned stimulus, buzzer tone, and a new neutral stimulus, flashing light. The second neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, CS, as well. When all is said and done, both stimuli, buzzer and flashing light, have gone from being neutral stimuli, NS, to conditioned stimuli, CS, and either of them can elicit the conditioned response, CR, of salivation. Note that in higher order conditioning, the second neutral stimulus, NS, is paired with a conditioned stimulus, CS, instead of being paired with the original unconditioned stimulus, US. Pavlov, 1927-1960. In our example, the flashing light is associated with the buzzer sound, not with the food directly. Conditioning, higher order conditioning. Extended description for Figure 5.1, higher order conditioning. Figure 5.1, higher order conditioning. Once an association has been made through classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus, CS, can be used to learn new associations. When a conditioned stimulus, CS, such as a buzzer that now triggers salivation, is repeatedly paired with a neutral stimulus, NS, such as a flashing light, the dog will learn to salivate in response to the light, without food ever being present. These multiple layers of learning help us understand how humans form associations between many different stimuli. These multiple layers of learning help us understand how humans form associations between many different stimuli. Classical conditioning in your life. Classical conditioning is not limited to salivation. It affects you in ways you may not even realize. Just think of what happens to your heart rate when you walk into a room where you have had a bad experience, or when you come face to face with a person, perhaps a boss, who has caused you great anxiety. The same learning process that makes you anxious around your boss can make you excited in a good way when presented with stimuli that have romantic significance. Perhaps there is a song you have come to associate with someone you find really attractive. When you hear that song, you feel a change in your body, your heart rate increases, and maybe your cheeks start to flush. The physiological arousal is a classically conditioned response. We launched the discussion of classical conditioning with the story of Gavin, the ATF dog who became fearful of everyday sounds after serving in the Iraq War. Let's apply our newfound knowledge of classical conditioning to conjecture. Let's apply our newfound knowledge of classical conditioning to conjecture how Gavin's unusual behaviors developed, and discover how Caesar helped this yellow lab overcome his fear. From Ivan Pavlov to Cesar Millan, An explosion is an alarming event. Think of the sound it emits as an unconditioned stimulus, US, that can elicit a physiological fear response of shaking. The unconditioned response, UR, somewhere along the line, Gavin likely heard another sound paired with explosions, perhaps the faint popping sound of faraway artillery fire. It doesn't seem too far-fetched that one would hear artillery fire and explosions in the same general location. After repeated pairings of the distant artillery fire, the neutral stimulus, NS, and the nearby explosion sound, the unconditioned stimulus, US, Gavin came to associate these two stimuli. During this acquisition phase, the sound of distant artillery fire became a conditioned stimulus, CS, that could elicit the conditioned response, CR, of shaking. In other words, the sound of artillery fire came to evoke the same physiological response, shaking, as an explosion. So what does all of this have to do with Gavin's fear of beeping microwaves, cell phones, and elevators? We can only speculate because we weren't there to observe Gavin, but supposing he was conditioned to fear the sound of distant artillery fire, it's possible that this fear became generalized to other rhythmic mechanical sounds such as beeping cell phones and elevators. Through stimulus generalization, these non-dangerous sounds began to evoke a conditioned response, CR, as well. How could this seemingly classically conditioned response be extinguished? One option would be to pair a new response with the unconditioned stimulus, US, or the conditioned stimulus, CS. Caesar took this approach and it worked wonders. To help Gavin overcome his fear of everyday loud noises, conditioned stimulus, Caesar combined those sounds with something relaxing or pleasurable. For example, he would create a loud noise just as he presented Gavin with his favorite food, carrots, to reduce Gavin's fear of truly frightening sounds like thunder, fireworks, and explosions. Unconditioned stimulus. Caesar placed him in a virtual reality environment. As Gavin walked on a treadmill, an activity that appeared to relax him, Caesar exposed him to sounds he feared most, not all at once, but in small steps. Eventually, Gavin's fear response diminished, and he could visit a firing range without shutting down or shaking, according to Milan and Peltier, 2010. In the Treatment of Psychological Disorders chapter, we present similar techniques used by therapists to help clients struggling with anxiety and fear. Calm in the water. According to Caesar, being in the water brings out the instinctual side of most dogs, connecting them with nature and making them feel calm. To help Gavin, the ATF dog, overcome his fear of everyday noises, the conditioned stimulus, Caesar paired the disturbing sounds with activities that were relaxing and pleasurable for Gavin. We've learned how classical conditioning can cause a variety of reflexive responses, including salivation, Pavlov's dogs, increased heart rate humans, and shaking Gavin. Would you believe that this form of learning can also make you feel nauseous? Yuck. Conditioned taste, aversion. LO5 summarize how classical conditioning is dependent on the biology of the organism. Have you ever experienced food poisoning? After falling ill from something you ate, whether it was bad fish, uncooked chicken, or tainted butter, you probably steered clear of that particular food for a while. This is an example of conditioned taste aversion, a powerful form of classical conditioning that occurs when an organism learns to associate a particular food or drink with illness. Often it only takes a single pairing between a food and a bad feeling, that is, one trial learning, for an organism to change its behavior. Imagine a grizzly bear that avoids poisonous berries after it vomits from eating them. In this case, the unconditioned stimulus, US, is the poison in the berries. The unconditioned response, UR, is the vomiting. After acquisition, the conditioned stimulus, CS, would be the sight of the berries, and the conditioned response, CR, would be a nauseous feeling. In all likelihood, the bear would avoid the berries in the future. Avoiding foods that induce sickness has adaptive behavior. Avoiding foods that induce sickness has adaptive value, meaning it helps organisms survive, upping the odds they will reproduce. Avoiding foods that induce sickness has adaptive value, meaning it helps organisms survive, upping the odds they will reproduce and pass their genes along to the next generation. According to the evolutionary perspective, humans and other animals have a powerful drive to ensure that they and their offspring reach reproductive age. So it's critical to steer clear of tastes that have been associated with illness. Connections. In Chapter 1, we introduce the evolutionary perspective, which suggests that behaviors and traits are shaped by natural selection. Here, this perspective helps clarify why some types of learning are so powerful. In the case of conditioned taste aversion, species gain an evolutionary advantage through quick and efficient learning about poisonous foods. How might conditioning taste aversion play out in your life? Suppose you eat a hot dog a few hours before coming down with a stomach virus that coincidentally spreading. How might conditioned taste aversion play out in your life? Suppose you eat a hot dog a few hours before coming down with a stomach virus that's coincidentally spreading throughout your college campus. The hot dog isn't responsible for your illness, and you may be aware of this, but thereafter the slightest taste of one or the thought of eating one can make you feel sick even after you have recovered. Physical experiences like this can sometimes be so strong that they override our knowledge of the facts. Try this. Identify the neutral stimulus, NS, the unconditioned stimulus, US, the unconditioned response, UR, the conditioned stimulus, CS, and the conditioned response, CR, in the hot dog scenario. The neutral stimulus, NS, is the sight of a hot dog. The unconditioned stimulus, US, is the virus. The unconditioned response, UR, is the upset stomach. The conditioned stimulus, CS, is the sight or thought of a hot dog. And the conditioned response, CR, is the sick feeling you get even after you have recovered. Rats with belly aches. U.S. psychologist John Garcia, 1917 through 2012, and his colleagues demonstrated conditioned taste aversion in their well-known studies with laboratory rats, according to Garcia et al. 1966. They designed a series of experiments to explore how rats would respond to eating and drinking foods that became associated with sickness. In one study, Garcia and his colleagues provided the animals with flavored water, followed by injections of a drug that upset their stomachs. The animals rejected that flavored drink thereafter. The rats in Garcia's studies seemed naturally inclined to link their internal malaise, sick feeling, to tastes and smells, and less likely to associate their nausea with things they heard or saw, according to Garcia et al. 1966. This is clearly adaptive because nausea often results from indigestion. This is clearly adaptive because nausea often results from ingesting food that is poisonous or spoiled. In order to survive, an animal must be able to recognize and shun the tastes of dangerous substances. Garcia's research highlights the importance of biological preparedness, the predisposition or inclination of animals and people to form certain kinds of associations through classical conditioning. Conditioned taste aversion is a powerful form of learning. Would you believe it can be used to save endangered species? Connections. In Chapter 1, we introduced two types of research, basic and applied. Basic research is focused on gathering knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Applied research focuses on changing behaviors and outcomes, often leading to real-world applications. Here we see how classical conditioning principles are applied to protect wildlife. Didn't see that coming. Rescuing animals with classical conditioning. An animal is in trouble in Australia. A large lizard called the floodplain goanna is threatened by a non-native cane toad that is invading its tropical habitat. Cane toads may look delicious, at least to the goannas, but they pack a lethal dose of poison, killing the unlucky lizards that try to feast on them. Cane toads are extraordinarily difficult to control, according to Indigo ETAL 2018, page 592. In areas where they have invaded, goanna populations have plummeted, with death estimates exceeding 90%, according to Petit ETAL 2021 and Ujvari and Madsen 2009. How could you use conditioned taste aversion to protect these lizards from looming toad invasions? Remember that conditioned taste aversion occurs when an organism rejects a food or drink after consuming it and becoming very sick. To encourage the goannas to avoid the toxic toads, you must teach them to associate the little amphibians with nausea. You could do this by feeding them baby cane toads. Unlike their parents, these youngsters pack a sublethal dose of poison, enough to induce nausea, but not enough to cause death. After an unpleasant training with the baby toads, the goannas should avoid eating the more dangerous adult toads. Researchers from the University of Sydney used such an approach, and the results were promising. Goannas subjected to conditioned taste aversion prior to a toad invasion, where goannas subjected to conditioned taste aversion prior to a toad invasion were less likely than their unconditioned comrades to eat the killer toads and die, according to Ward Fear ETAL 2016 and Ward Fear ETAL 2017. Similar approaches have been tried with other wildlife in Australia and in animals across the world, according to Snitchers ETAL 2021. For example, researchers in Spain used conditioned taste aversion to discourage foxes from preying upon partridge eggs. Institute for Game and Wildlife Research 2020, and a group in India demonstrated that this approach may also be effective on monkeys that steal human crops, according to Pebsworth and Radhakrishna 2020. As you may observe, lessons learned by psychologists working in labs can have far-reaching applications. Learning to the rescue. Australia's large lizard species, the floodplain goanna, held by the University of Sydney researcher Dr. Georgia Ward-Fear, is threatened by the introduction of an invasive species known as the cane toad on the right. The goannas eat the toads, which carry a lethal dose of poison, but they can learn to avoid this toxic prey through conditioned taste aversion. according to Ward Fear ETAL 2017. Lessons from Little Albert. LO6 described the Little Albert study and explain how fear can be learned. So far, we have focused chiefly on the classical conditioning of physical responses like salivation, shaking, and nausea. Now let's take a closer look at how classical conditioning can influence emotions. A conditioned emotional response occurs when a neutral stimulus, NS, is paired with a stimulus that creates an emotional reaction. The classic case study of Little Albert, conducted by John B. Watson, 1878 through 1958, and Rosalie Rayner, 1898 through 1935, is a frequently cited illustration of a conditioned emotional response, according to Watson and Rayner, 1920. Little Albert was around 9 months old when he first assessed. Little Albert was around 9 months old when first assessed by Watson and Rayner, according to Griggs 2015D and Powell ETAL 2014. Initially, he had no fear of rats. In fact, he was rather intrigued by the white critters and sometimes reached out to touch them. But all this changed when Albert was about 11 months old. That's when the researchers began banging a hammer against a steel bar, an unconditioned stimulus for a fear response in younger children. Whenever he reached for the rat, Harris, 1979, Albert was about 11 months old. That's when the researchers began banging a hammer against a steel bar, an unconditioned stimulus for a fear response in younger children, whenever he reached for the rat, according to Harris, 1979. After 7 pairings of the loud noise and the appearance of the rat, Albert began to fear rats and generalized this fear to other furry objects, including a sealskin coat and a rabbit, according to Harris, 1979. The sight of the rat went from being a neutral stimulus, NS, to a conditioned stimulus, CS, and Albert's fear of the rat became a conditioned response, CR. Poor Albert. Little Albert was a baby who developed a fear of rats through his participation in an ethically questionable experiment conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner. Watson and Rayner repeatedly showed the child a rat while terrifying him with a loud banging sound. According to Watson and Rayner, 1920, Albert quickly learned to associate the sight of the rat with the scary noise. His resulting fear of rats was conditioned emotional response. Nobody knows exactly what happened to little Albert after he participated in Watson and Rayner's research. Scholars have attempted to determine his fate, but their efforts have been criticized for potential bias and flaws in logic. Digdon, 2020, Harris, 2020. Some believe little Albert's true identity is still unknown, according to Powell, 2010, and Reese, 2010. Others have proposed little Albert was Douglas Merritt. Others have proposed little Albert was Douglas Merritt, who had a neurological condition called hydrocephalus and died at age 6, according to Beck, ETAL 2009, and Fridlund, ETAL 2012 and 2020. Still others suggest little Albert was a healthy baby named William Albert Barger, who lived until 2007, Bartlett 2014, Digdon, ETAL 2014. Researchers cannot be sure, and we may never know the true identity of little Albert or the long-term effects of his conditioning through this unethical study. Although Watson and Rayner, 1920, Although Watson and Rayner, 1920, discussed how they might have reduced little Albert's fear, for example, giving him candy while presenting the rat, they did not provide him with such treatment, according to Griggs' 2014 Although their study is among the most widely cited in psychology, there are questions about its reported findings. Researchers who have examined video footage of the experiment argue that Watson may have manipulated and misrepresented certain aspects of the study to strengthen its impact as an example of fear conditioning, according to Powell and Schmaltz, 2021, page 165. The Little Albert study would never happen today, at least we hope it wouldn't. Contemporary psychologists conduct research according to stringent ethical guidelines, and instilling terror in a baby would not be considered acceptable, nor would such a study be allowed at research institutions. Do you buy it? Do you buy it? Classical conditioning affects you in ways you may not realize. Table 5.1. Advertisements can instill emotions and attitudes toward product brands, and these classically conditioned responses may linger as long as 3 weeks, according to Grossman and Till, 1998. This does not mean that classical conditioning can force you to go out and spend money on items you otherwise would not buy. Just be aware that advertising may influence your attitudes in ways beyond your awareness. Think about how your perception of a product might change when you see a celebrity using it. Fenty Beauty makeup looks pretty appealing on the face of Rihanna, and who can resist Adidas gear worn by Yankee slugger Aaron Judge? Celebrity endorsements can promote more positive attitudes toward products, especially when the celebrity is male and is well matched with the item. A basketball player endorsing basketball shoes, for example, according to Knoll and Mathis, 2017. Although celebrities tend to make a big impression, social media influencers may have more clout when it comes to advertising. This may be because influencers are deemed more trustworthy than celebrities, and people feel more similar to influencers and identify more with them than celebrities, according to Schutten, ETAL 2019, page 276. Heat, Catch the Fever, the first fragrance by Beyonce. www.beyonceperfumes.com, available at Macy's and at Macy's.com. Extended description for Does Sexy Sell? Does Sexy Sell? Beyonce appears in an ad campaign for Heat, a fragrance for women. Advertisements may evoke emotions and instill attitudes toward brands through classical conditioning, according to Chen, ETAL 2013, Grossman and Till, 1998, and Poels and DeWitt, 2019. But how do these psychological changes affect sales? Now that is a question worth researching. Table 5.1, real-life examples of classical conditioning. Type, NS and US, expected response. Advertising. Repeated pairing of products such as cars, NS, with celebrities, US. Automatic response to celebrity may include sexual desire and arousal or increased heart rate, UR. Pairing leads to a similar response, CR, to the product, CS. Fears. Pairing a dog lunging, US, at you, and the street where the dog lives, NS. Automatic response to the dog lunging at you is fear, UR. Pairing leads to a similar response of fear, CR, to the street, CS, where the dog lives. Fetishes. Repeated pairings of originally non-sexual objects like shoes, NS, and sexual activity, US. Automatic response to sexual activity is sexual arousal, UR. Pairing leads to sexual arousal, CR, in response to the objects, CS. Romance. Repeated pairings of a cologne, NS, with your romantic partner, US. Automatic response to your feelings for your partner is sexual arousal, UR. Pairing leads to sexual arousal, CR, in response to the cologne, CS. Pet behavior. Repeated pairings of an electric can opener sound, NS, and the serving of food, US. Automatic response to food is the dog and or cat's salivation, UR. Pairing leads to salivation, CR, in response to the sound of the can opener, CS. Startle reaction. Repeated pairings of seeing someone squeeze a balloon, NS, with the sudden pop of the balloon breaking, US. Automatic response to the pop sound is flinching, UR. Pairing causes the person to flinch, CR, in response to the sight of someone squeezing the balloon, CS. The implications of classical conditioning extend far beyond salivation. The implications of classical conditioning extend far beyond salivating dogs. Here are just a few examples illustrating its widespread relevance. The time has come to wrap up our discussion of classical conditioning. Remember, this type of learning is associated with automatic or involuntary behaviors. In the next section, we'll shift our focus to voluntary behaviors. How do we learn to get things we want and avert unpleasant events? Read on. Show what you know. Question number 1. Blank is a learning process in which two stimuli become associated. The answer is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a learning process in which two stimuli become associated. Question number 2. Because of blank, animals and people are predisposed to form associations that increase their chances of survival. The answer is biological preparedness. Because of biological preparedness, animals and people are predisposed to form associations that increase their chances of survival. Question number 3. Watson and Rayner used classical conditioning to instill fear in little Albert. Create a diagram of the NS, US, UR, CS, and CR in their experiment. In what way did little Albert exhibit stimulus generalization? When little Albert heard the loud bang, it was an unconditioned stimulus, US, that elicited fear, the unconditioned response, UR, through conditioning. The sight of the rat became paired with the loud noise, and thus the rat went from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, CS. Little Albert's fear of the rat became a conditioned response, CR. Little Albert exhibited stimulus generalization, as he not only began to fear rats, but also generalized this fear to other furry objects, including a sealskin coat and rabbit. Question number 4. Hamburgers were once your favorite food, but ever since you ate a burger tainted with salmonella, a common cause of food poisoning, you cannot smell or taste one without feeling nauseous. Which of the following is the unconditioned stimulus? Is the answer A, salmonella, B, nausea, C, hamburgers, D, the hamburger vendor? The answer is A. Salmonella. Hamburgers were once your favorite food, but ever since you ate a burger tainted with salmonella, a common cause of food poisoning, you cannot smell or taste one without feeling nauseous. Which of the following is the unconditioned stimulus? The answer is A. Salmonella. Operant conditioning. We've got dog problems. Caesar spent much of his early life on his grandfather's cattle ranch in Ixpalino, a small town in Sinaloa, Mexico. He loved being around the ranch animals, especially the dogs. They lived in a pack of about 5 to 7 members, slept outside, and hunted wild animals. Caesar's family depended on the dogs to herd cattle and guard the property, but also gave them plenty of free time to splash around in the creek and play. The ranch dogs organized their activities as a pack, as wolves do in nature, and their needs for daily exercise were satisfied, according to Fine 2013, Milan, and Peltier 2006. When Caesar arrived in the United States, he encountered quite a different type of dog. In America, dogs dined on gourmet biscuits, slept on memory foam mattresses, and got their hair blown. In America, dogs dined on gourmet biscuits, slept on memory foam mattresses, and got their hair blown dry at doggy salons. Caesar began to realize that many people didn't understand their dogs or know how to communicate with them. The dogs were suffering from an untold number of issues, including anxiety, aggression, and hyperactivity, according to Milan and Peltier 2006. In order to fix the dogs' misbehaviors, Caesar would have to teach their human owners a few things. As Caesar often says, I rehabilitate dogs and I train people, according to Milan 2013, March 2026. According to Milan 2013, March 2026, paragraph 3. So how exactly does Caesar train humans? We can't possibly cover the myriad approaches he employs, but we can explore how operant conditioning impacts his work. Consequences matter. Whether pleasant or unpleasant, the effects of our behaviors influence what we do in the future. Think about the many consequences of Caesar's hard work. Helping people understand and connect with their dogs is one positive consequence. When I show them how the brain of a dog works, when I show them what makes a dog happy, when I show them how dogs communicate and how we can communicate with dogs, Caesar explains, then I see people understanding and making sense of what's happening. This is a rewarding experience for Caesar, one that makes him more likely to continue his work in the future. Imagine what would happen if all of Caesar's human clients ignored his advice and continued with their bad habits. How do you think this consequence would influence Caesar's future behaviors? Would he be more or less likely to continue his work rehabilitating dogs and training people? L07 describe Thorndike's law of effect. Thorndike and his cats, one of the first scientists to objectively study how consequences affect behavior, was U.S. psychologist Edward Thorndike, 1874 through 1949. Thorndike's early research focused on chicks and other animals, which he sometimes kept in his apartment. But after an incubator almost caught fire, his landlady insisted he get rid of the chicks, according to Hothersall, 2014. Thorndike was assisted by William James, whose habitual kindness and devotion to underdogs led him to house the chickens in his basement for a time, according to Thorndike, 1936, page 264. Researching the chicks was only a starting point, as Thorndike's most famous studies involved cats. One of his experimental setups involved putting a cat in a latched cage called a puzzle box and planting enticing pieces of fish outdoor. One of his experimental setups involved putting a cat in a latched cage called a puzzle box and planting enticing pieces of fish outside the door. When first placed in the box, the cat would scratch and paw around randomly. When first placed in the box, the cat would scratch and paw around randomly, but after a while, just by chance, it would pop the latch, causing the door to release. The cat would then escape the cage to devour the fish. Figure 5.2. The next time the cat was put in the box, it would repeat this random activity, scratching and pawing with no particular direction. And again, just by chance, the cat would pop the latch that released the door and freed it to eat the fish. Each time the cat was returned to the box, the number of random activities decreased until eventually it was able to break free almost immediately. Thorndike, 19. According to Thorndike, 1898. The cat's behavior, Thorndike reasoned, could be explained by the law of effect, which says that a behavior, opening the latch, is more likely to happen again when followed by a pleasurable outcome, delicious fish. Behaviors that led to pleasurable results will be repeated, while behaviors that don't lead to pleasurable results or are followed by something unpleasant will not be repeated. The law of effect is not limited to cats. When was the last time your behavior changed as a result of a pleasurable outcome? Extended description for figure 5.2, puzzle box. More, less. Time required to escape, number of trials. Figure 5.2, puzzle box. Early psychologist Edward Thorndike conducted his well-known cat experiments using puzzle boxes. Like the one shown here at the start of the experiment, Thorndike's cats pawed around haphazardly until they managed to unlatch the door and then eat the fish treats placed outside. As the trials wore on, the felines learned to free themselves more quickly. After several trials, the amount of time needed to escape the box dropped significantly. Refer to the graph above. Thorndike attributed this phenomenon to the law of effect, which essentially states that behaviors are more likely to reoccur if they are followed by pleasurable outcomes. Most contemporary psychologists would call the fish in Thorndike's experiments reinforcers, because these treats increased the likelihood that the preceding behavior, escaping the cage, would occur again. Reinforcers are consequences that follow behaviors, and our daily lives abound with them. A dog praised for sitting is more likely to obey the sit command in the future. An Instagram user who is reinforced with a lot of likes is more apt to post photos and videos in the future. Praise, hugs, good grades, enjoyable food, and attention can all act as reinforcers, increasing the probability that the behaviors they follow will be repeated. Through the process of reinforcement, target behaviors become more frequent. Skinner and behaviorism. Reinforcement is a key component of operant conditioning, a type of learning whereby people or animals come to associate their voluntary actions with consequences. B.F. Skinner coined the term, and its meaning is fairly simple. The term operant emphasizes the fact that the behavior operates on the environment to generate consequences, and in operant conditioning, we strengthen an operant in the sense of making a response more probable or more frequent, according to Skinner, 1953, page 65. Some of the earliest and most influential research on operant conditioning came from Skinner's lab. His work followed the principles of behaviorism, the scientific study of observable behavior. Behaviorists believe that psychology can only be considered a true science if it restricts itself to the study of behaviors that can be seen and documented. And although mental processes such as memory and emotion may not be directly observable, Skinner and other behaviorists have proposed that all behaviors, thoughts, and emotions are shaped by factors in the experiment environment. And although mental processes such as memory and emotion may not be directly observable, Skinner and other behaviorists have proposed that all behaviors, thoughts, and emotions are shaped by factors in the external environment. In other words, they are learned. Radical behaviorist. U.S. psychologist Burrhus Frederick Skinner, or simply B.F. Skinner, is one of the most influential psychologists of all time. Skinner believed that all thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, basically all things psychological, are shaped by factors in the environment. Using animal chambers, known as Skinner boxes, he conducted carefully controlled experiments on animal behavior. Types of reinforcement. Like most people who have achieved a high level of success and fame, Caesar has accumulated a fair number of critics. They question his antiquated view of dominance hierarchies, suggesting that his discipline before affection approach is misguided, according to Durr 2016, paragraph 2, and contend that his self-taught approach ignores 80 years of research in animal behavior, according to Breeden, ND, paragraph 35. Some claim he is too physical with the animals, forcing them into submission with foot taps to the area above the hind leg and vibrating collars, according to Barber 2012, Grossman 2012. Caesar has defined himself by saying he reserves these techniques for red zone dogs, those that pose a threat to other animals and or people and therefore may be at risk for being euthanized. My mission has always been to save dogs, especially troubled and abandoned dogs, he said in an interview with the Daily Mail. I've dedicated my life to this, according to Barber 2012, paragraph 4. We are not interested in taking sides here. Our goal is to examine the role of learning in Caesar's life and work. Watch him closely, and you'll see that he employs quite a bit of positive reinforcement. L08 explained how positive and negative reinforcement differ. Positive reinforcement. Earlier, we explained that a reinforcer is a consequence that increases the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. Any stimulus, good or bad, is considered a reinforcer if it eventually leads to an increase in the behavior that immediately precedes it. What we haven't addressed is that a reinforcer can be something added or something taken away. In the process of positive reinforcement, reinforcers are presented added following the target behavior, and they are generally pleasant. The fish treats that Thorndike's cats received for escaping the puzzle box were positive reinforcers. They were pleasurable, they were added following the desired behavior, and they increase the frequency of that desired behavior. What reinforcers does Caesar employ in dog rehabilitation? Sometimes it's not as obvious as a biscuit or bone, but what reinforcers does Caesar employ in dog rehabilitation? Sometimes it's not as obvious as a biscuit or bone. Before giving reinforcement, Caesar explains you have to help your dog feel calm and happy, and that requires exercise and mental stimulation. Once the dog reaches that relaxed state, you can reinforce it with affection. It's important to remember that the definition of positive reinforcer depends entirely on the organism receiving it, according to Skinner, 1953. For some dogs, playtime is a powerful positive reinforcer. Remember, Gavin, the ATF agent with the classically conditioned response to certain noises, After Gavin completed his sessions in the virtual reality environment, Caesar would reinforce the lab's good work with a vigorous play period, which often meant a dip in the pool, according to Milan and Peltier, 2010, page 63. Dogs offer positive reinforcement to humans as well. You just have to be perceptive enough to notice. Consider this example from Caesar. Your dog wants to go outside and pee. He sits by the door, you open the door, the dog walks out, but as he passes by you, he looks up at you for a moment and makes eye contact. He just rewarded you, according to Milan and Peltier, 2010, page 121. Why is eye contact reinforcing? When you gaze into your dog's eyes, both you and the dog release the hormone oxytocin, which plays an important role in social bonding. Oxytocin increases social reward and enhances attachment between infants and their mothers and between sexual partners. Eye contact is just one of the ways dogs and humans have established mutually reinforcing relationships during the course of evolution, according to MacLean and Hare, 2015, and Nagasawa, ETAL, 2015. Connections. In the biology and behavior chapter, we introduce oxytocin, a chemical that can behave as both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. Oxytocin levels rise during the early stages of a romantic relationship, and its activity may be associated with feelings of love. But take note. Note all positive reinforcers are pleasant. When we refer to positive reinforcement, we just mean that something either pleasant or unpleasant has been added. For example, if a child is starved for attention, then any kind of attention, including a reprimand, might act as a positive reinforcer. Every time the child misbehaves, they get reprimanded, and reprimanding is a form of attention, which the child craves. The scolding reinforces the misbehavior. One other interesting fact about positive reinforcement: it can lead to superstitious behavior. Have you ever known someone who wears a good luck piece of clothing? For example, your friend wears a special baseball cap every time the Red Sox are playing because the first time they wore it, the Red Sox won. That win and every subsequent win has nothing to do with your friend's hat, but the hat-wearing behavior is nevertheless reinforced. According to Hayashi and Modico, 2019. Negative reinforcement: we have established that behaviors can be increased or strengthened by the addition of a stimulus, but it is also possible to increase a behavior by taking something away. Behaviors increase in response to negative reinforcement through the process of taking away or subtracting something unpleasant. Skinner demonstrated how negative reinforcement could be used to influence the behavior of rats. He placed them in special cages with floors that delivered a continuous mild electric current, except when they pushed on a lever. At the start of the experiment, the animals would scamper around the floors to escape the electric current, but every once in a while, they would accidentally hit the lever and turn off the electric current. Eventually, they learned to associate pushing the lever with the removal of the unpleasant stimulus, a mild shock. After several trials, the rats would push the lever immediately, reducing the amount of time they were exposed to the current. Think about some examples of negative reinforcement in your own life. Have you ever started driving before putting on your seatbelt? If so, you likely heard an annoying beeping sound. In order to stop the beeping, an unpleasant stimulus, you buckle up the desired behavior. Automakers have cleverly used negative reinforcement to increase seatbelt use. We are more inclined to buckle up right away, an increase in the desired behavior, because we have learned that it stops the beeping. For another example, think about a dog that constantly begs for treats. The begging, an unpleasant stimulus, stops the moment the dog is given a treat, a pattern that increases your treat-giving behavior. Meanwhile, the dog's begging behavior is being strengthened through positive reinforcement. The dog has learned that the more it begs, the more treats it receives. The previous two examples involved stopping unwanted stimuli in the present moment. But sometimes we learn to avoid unpleasant stimuli that may happen in the future. Do you get regular dental checkups? If so, it's probably not because you have painful dental issues right now, but because you want to avoid them in the future. Through experience, you have learned you can avoid tooth pain through routine care. Remember that with negative reinforcement, desired behaviors increase in order to avoid or escape an unwanted stimulus. LO9. Distinguish between primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary and secondary reinforcers. There are two major categories of reinforcers, primary and secondary. The fish Thorndike gave his cats is considered a primary reinforcer because it satisfies a biological need. Food, water, and physical contact are considered primary reinforcers for both animals and people because they meet essential requirements. Secondary reinforcers do not satisfy biological needs, but often derive their power from their connection with primary reinforcers. Money is not a primary reinforcer, but we know from experience that it gives us access to primary reinforcers such as food, a safe place to live, and perhaps even the ability to attract desirable mates. Thus, money is a secondary reinforcer. Good grades and extra credit assignments might also be considered secondary reinforcers, according to Whittington 2019, because doing well in school leads to job opportunities which provide money to pay for food and other basic needs. Trophy culture. In decades past, trophies and medals were only awarded to top teams and players. These days, children often receive such rewards for simply participating. Some claim that participation trophies fail to prepare kids for a competitive world. Others value the idea of reinforcing children, especially younger ones, for making an effort regardless of their skill or success, according to Dickinson 2019. Research suggests we should encourage children to focus on their own improvement Am I doing better than last year? Rather than comparing themselves to others, according to Gurel and Brumelman, 2020. Secondary reinforcers influence your everyday social interactions. Think about how your behaviors change in response to praise from a boss, a pat on the back from a coworker, or a like from one of your followers on social media. Didn't see that coming? Tapping into the brain's reward circuit. Why do you keep glancing at TikTok? And what compels you to check your phone 10 times an hour? All those little updates you receive can serve as reinforcers. Getting reposted or seeing your photos and videos liked makes you more likely to post content in the future. The lure of digital technology is powerful. As one study found, college students find their phones more reinforcing than food, according to O'Donnell and Epstein, 2019, page 130. Underlying this process of social media reinforcement are patterns of brain activity scientists are just beginning to understand. One part of the brain that seems to play a key role in social media behaviors and reinforcement learning in general is the ventral striatum, according to Abrams 2022, Averbeck and O'Doherty. According to Abrams 2022, Averbeck and O'Doherty 2022, this region gets a dopamine and oxytocin rush whenever we experience social rewards, says APA's Chief Science Officer Mitch Prinstein, according to Abrams 2022, paragraph 7. For example, when young people give or receive likes on Instagram, the ventral striatum and other parts of the brain's reward circuit become activated. Sherman et al. 2016, Sherman et al. 2018. Marketers are well aware of the dopamine gold mine offered by social media, and they may use it to promote brands, according to Parkin 2018, Sote 2015, page 20. Remember this the next time you share commercial content through social media. In doing so, you are airing someone else's message, and you may be fueling an ad campaign. Now that we have explored some ways that reinforcement impacts your daily life, let's venture back into the lab and see how this process can produce some astonishing animal behaviors. Shaping and successive approximations. LO10 explains shaping and the method of successive approximations. Building on Thorndike's law of effect and Watson's approach to research, Skinner demonstrated, among other things, that rats can learn to push levers and pigeons can learn to bowl, according to Peterson 2004. Animals cannot immediately perform such complex tasks, but they can learn through successive approximations. The use of reinforcers to change behaviors through small steps toward a desired behavior. Infographic 5.2. Skinner placed animals in chambers or Skinner boxes outfitted with food dispensers. The animals could activate by pecking a target or pushing on a lever, for instance, and recording equipment to monitor these behaviors as shown in the earlier photo. Such boxes allowed Skinner to conduct carefully controlled experiments, measuring activity with precision and advancing the scientific and systematic study of behavior. Some of Skinner's most incredible results occurred through shaping, a process in which a person observes the behaviors of another organism, an animal for example, and provides reinforcers if the organism performs at a required level. Through shaping by successive approximations, Skinner taught a rat to play basketball, dropping a marble through a hole, and pigeons to bowl, nudging a ball down a miniature alley, according to Goddard, 2018, and Peterson, 2000. Let's nail down this concept using the bowling pigeons example. Skinner's first task was to break the bowling lessons into activities the birds could accomplish. Next, he introduced reinforcers, usually food, as a reward for behaviors that came closer and closer to achieving the desired goal. Bowling a strike, choosing the right increments for the behaviors was crucial. If his expectations started too high, the pigeons would never receive any reinforcers. If his expectations were too low, the pigeons would get reinforcers for most everything they did. If his expectations were too low, the pigeons would get reinforcers for most everything they did. Either way, they would be able to make the critical connection between desired behavior and the reward. Every time the animals did something that brought them a step closer to completing the desired behavior, they would get a reinforcer. The first reward might be given for simply looking at the ball, the second for bending down and touching it, and the third for nudging the ball with their beaks. By the end of the experiment, the pigeons were driving balls down miniature alleys, knocking down pins with a swipe of the beak, according to Peterson, 2004. Shaping by successive approximations can also be used with humans who are sometimes unwilling or unable to change problematic behaviors overnight. For example, psychologists have employed this approach to change truancy behavior in adolescence, according to Enia and Daphneau, 2009. The truant teens were provided reinforcers for consistent attendance, but with small steps requiring increasingly more days in school. Infographic 5.2, Learning through Operant Conditioning. Operant conditioning is a type of learning in which we associate our voluntary actions with the consequences of those actions. For example, a pigeon naturally pecks things, but every time the pigeon pecks a ball, it is given a reinforcer. The pigeon will soon learn to peck the ball more frequently. B.F. Skinner showed that operant conditioning could do more than elicit simple, isolated actions. He taught pigeons to bowl and play tennis with the help of shaping. That is, he observed their behaviors and provided reinforcers when they performed at a required level. Today, shaping is used routinely by parents, teachers, coaches, and employers to change behaviors. Skinner's experiment: train a pigeon to play tennis. Pigeon is rewarded with seeds for packing. Pigeon is rewarded with seeds for pecking the ball. Peck, reinforcement with seeds. Ball pecking behavior increases. Reinforcement, peck, reinforcement, peck, reinforcement. Now only the next step toward tennis is rewarded. Peck, pushing the ball, reinforcement with seeds. Ball pushing behavior increases. Pushing the ball, reinforcement. Pushing the ball, reinforcement. Pushing the ball, reinforcement. After behavior has been shaped through reinforcement, the pigeon has learned to play tennis. Have you been trained? Not every child is born loving the healthy foods their parent offers, but shaping can help a child learn to eat their vegetables. Over a period of time, reinforcement is given for behaviors that are closer and closer to this goal. Can you think of anything that would be a reward for eating vegetables? Praise or the excitement of a contest may work in this way. 1. Child refuses to eat vegetables. 2. Yes, reinforced for touching fork. 3. Good job, now reinforced for touching vegetables. 4. After behavior has been shaped through reinforcement, the child has learned to eat their vegetables. Extended description for infographic 5.2, Learning through Operant Conditioning. It is amazing that the principles of animal training can also be harnessed to keep teenagers in school. Is there anything operant conditioning can't accomplish? Think critically. Chickens can't play baseball. Rats can be conditioned to press levers. Pigeons can be trained to bowl. And believe it or not, chickens can learn to dance and play the piano, according to Breland and Breland, 1951, Keller and Marianne Breland, 1915 through 1965, and 1920 through 2001. A pair of Skinner's students managed to train 6,000 animals not only to dance but also to vacuum, dine at a table, and play sports and musical instruments. Breland and Breland, 1961. But as hard as they tried, the Brelands could not coax a chicken to play baseball. Here's a rundown of what happened. The Brelands placed a chicken in a cage adjacent to a scaled-down baseball field, where it had access to a loop attached to a baseball bat. If the chicken managed to swing the bat hard enough to send the ball into the outfield, a food reward was delivered at the other end of the cage. Off the bird would go, running toward its meal dispenser like a baseball player sprinting to first base, or so the routine was supposed to go. But as soon as the Brelands took away the cage, the chicken behaved nothing like a baseball player. Instead, it madly chased and pecked at the ball. Breland and Breland, 1961. Musical bunny. Keller and Marion Breland observe one of their animal performers at the IQ Zoo in Hot Springs, Arkansas, circa 1960. Using the operant conditioning concepts they learned from B.F. Skinner, the Brelands trained ducks to play guitars, raccoons to shoot basketballs, and chickens to tell fortunes. But their animal students did not always cooperate. Sometimes their animal students did not always cooperate. Sometimes their instincts interfered with the conditioning process, according to BIM ETAL 2010. How did the Brelands explain the chicken's behavior? They believed that the birds were demonstrating instinctive drift, the tendency for instinct to undermine conditioned behaviors. A chicken's pecking, for example, is an instinctive food-getting behavior, although it's useful for opening seeds and killing insects. Breland and Breland, 1961. Pecking won't help the bird get to first base. Animal behavior can be shaped by forces in the environment's nurture, but instinct, nature, may interfere with the process. Continuous or partial. Now that we have a basic understanding of what reinforcement can and cannot accomplish, let's explore the various ways it may be delivered. LO11 describe continuous reinforcement and partial reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement, when it comes to teaching new behaviors to dogs, children, and other organisms, most psychologists would agree that positive reinforcement is extremely effective. Let's say you are teaching your puppy to sit. You begin the process by giving them a treat every time they obey the sit command. Rewarding the pup in this manner is called continuous reinforcement. Because the reinforcer is presented every time the desired behavior occurs, continuous reinforcement can be used in a variety of settings. A child getting praise every time they do the dishes, a salesperson receiving a bonus every time they make a sale. You get the commonality reinforcement every time the behavior occurs. Partial reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is ideal for establishing new behaviors during the initial learning phase, but delivering reinforcers intermittently generally works better for maintaining behaviors. We call this approach partial reinforcement. Returning to the examples of continuous reinforcement, we can also imagine applying partial reinforcement. The child gets praise almost every time they do the dishes. A salesperson gets a bonus for every third sale they make. The reinforcer is not given every time the behavior is observed, only on some occasions. The amazing thing about partial reinforcement is that it happens to all of us in an infinite number of settings, and we might never know how many times we have been partially reinforced for any particular behavior. Common to all these partial reinforcement situations is that the target behavior is exhibited, but the reinforcer is not supplied each time it occurs. Just one more try. Have you ever played the claw machine game at a carnival? Put some money in the machine and guide the claw. Have you ever played the claw machine game at a carnival? Put some money in the machine and guide the claw to pick up a prize. The claw rarely grabs onto anything, yet you keep trying over and over. Your behavior is likely driven by partial or intermittent reinforcement. Partial reinforcement effect. Skinner used partial reinforcement to train his pigeons to peck at a target. Once the behavior had been learned, they would continue to peck at the target up to 10,000 times with no further reinforcers given. Once the behavior had been learned, they would continue to peck at the target up to 10,000 times with no further reinforcers given, according to Skinner, 1953. According to Skinner, nothing of this sort is ever obtained after continuous reinforcement, page 99. The same seems to be true with humans. In one study from the mid-1950s, researchers observed college students playing slot machines. Some of the slot machines provided continuous reinforcement, delivering pretend coins every time students pulled their levers. Other slot machines provided partial reinforcement, dispensing coins only some of the time. After the students played 8 rounds, all of the machines stopped giving coins. Without any coins to reinforce them, the students stopped pulling the levers, but not at the same time. Those who had received coins with every lever pull gave up more quickly than those rewarded intermittently. In other words, lever pulling behavior took longer to extinguish when established through partial reinforcement, according to Lewis and Duncan, 1956. Psychologists call this phenomenon the partial reinforcement effect. Behaviors take longer to disappear through the process of extinction, when they have been acquired or maintained through partial rather than continuous reinforcement. Some people in particular, those who gamble frequently, seem to be especially responsive to partial reinforcement, though it's not clear whether this tendency is a precursor to gambling or the result of it. According to Horsley, ETAL 2012, Ramnero, ETAL 2019. Remember, partial reinforcement works very well for maintaining behaviors, but not necessarily for establishing behaviors. Remember, partial reinforcement works very well for maintaining behaviors, but not necessarily for establishing behaviors. Imagine how long it would take Skinner's pigeons to accomplish the first step in learning how to bowl if they were rewarded for looking at the ball only every fifth time. The birds learn fastest when reinforced every time, but their behavior will persist longer if they are given partial reinforcement thereafter. Timing is everything. Reinforcement schedules. LO12. Name the schedules of reinforcement and give examples of each. Skinner identified various ways to administer partial reinforcement or partial reinforcement schedules. As often occurs in scientific research, he stumbled on the idea by chance. Late on Friday afternoon, Skinner realized he was running low on the food pellets he used as reinforcers for his laboratory animals. If he continued to reward the animals on a continuous basis, the pellets would run out before the end of the weekend. With this in mind, he decided to reinforce only some of the desired behaviors, according to Skinner 1956 and 1976. The new strategy worked like a charm. The animals kept performing the desired behaviors even though they weren't given reinforcers every time. Clearly, partial reinforcement is effective, but how exactly should it be delivered? 4 different reinforcement schedules can be used: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Infographic 5.3. Fixed ratio schedule. If reinforcement is delivered in a fixed ratio schedule, the subject must exhibit a preset number of desired responses or behaviors before a reinforcer is given. A pigeon in a Skinner box, for example, must peck a spot 5 times in order to score a delicious pellet. Generally, the fixed ratio schedule produces a high response rate, but with a characteristic dip immediately following the reinforcement. Pigeons rest briefly before pecking away at the target again. Some instructors use the fixed ratio schedule to reinforce attendance. For example, extra points are given when all students show up on time for 3 classes in a row. Variable ratio schedule. In a variable ratio schedule, the subject must exhibit a specific number of desired responses or behaviors before a reinforcer is given, but the number changes across trials, fluctuating around a pre-calculated average. If the goal is to train a pigeon to check a spot on a target, a variable ratio schedule can be used as follows. Trial 1. The pigeon gets a pellet after pecking the spot twice. Trial 2. The pigeon gets a pellet after pecking the spot once. Trial 3. The pigeon gets a pellet after pecking the spot 3 times, and so on. Here's another example. To encourage on-time attendance, an instructor provides extra points after several classes in a row, but students don't know if this will happen on the 3rd class, the 2nd class, or the 5th class because of its unpredictability. The variable ratio schedule tends to produce a high response rate and behaviors that are difficult to distinguish.
Fixed interval schedule. Sometimes it's important to focus on the interval of time between reinforcers rather than the number of desired responses. In a fixed interval schedule, a reinforcer is given for the first target behavior occurring after a specific time interval. If a pigeon is on a fixed interval schedule of 30 seconds, it can peck away at the target once the interval starts, but it will only get a reinforcer following its first response after the 30 seconds have ended. With this schedule, the target behavior tends to increase as each time interval comes to an end. The pigeon pecks the spot more often when the time nears 30 seconds. Do you want to increase your focus while studying? Reinforce yourself with a treat after each hour you have worked without digital distractions. Variable interval schedule. Variable interval schedule. In a variable interval schedule, the length of time between reinforcers is unpredictable. In this schedule, the reinforcer comes after an interval of time goes by, but the length of the interval changes from trial to trial within a predetermined range based on an average interval length. Training a pigeon to peck a target on this schedule might look something like this. Trial 1, the pigeon gets a pellet after 41 seconds. Trial 2, the pigeon gets a pellet after 43 seconds. Trial 3, the pigeon gets a pellet after 40 seconds. And so on. As with the fixed interval schedule, the pigeon is rewarded for the first response it makes after the interval of time has passed. But in this case, the interval length varies from trial to trial. The variable interval schedule tends to encourage steady patterns of behavior. The pigeon tries its luck pecking a target once every 40 seconds or so. Want to increase your study group's focus? Reinforce them with a break following 45 minutes of steady work, and then after their next 30 minutes of work, keep them guessing. Infographic 5.3, schedules of reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is ideal for establishing new behaviors. But once learned, a behavior is best maintained through partial reinforcement. Partial reinforcement can be delivered according to 4 schedules: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Fixed ratio: subject must exhibit a predetermined number of desired responses before a reinforcer is given. Variable ratio: reinforcement is unpredictable, that is, the number of desired responses that must occur before a reinforcement is unpredictable, that is, the number of desired responses that must occur before a reinforcer is given changes across trials. Fixed interval: the reinforcer comes after a pre-established interval of time. The target response is only reinforced after the given time period is over. Variable interval: reinforcement follows the first target response after the time interval has elapsed. The length of the time interval changes from trial to trial. Which schedule of reinforcement matches each of the following examples? Choose from fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Test yourself. 1. Carefully handling Question number 1. Carefully handling customer concerns as the monthly, quality assurance audit approaches is an example of. Question number 2, you listen intently to your favorite radio show because its producers will randomly select times throughout the day for listeners to call in to win free tickets to a concert. This is an example of. Question number 3, finding it difficult to walk away from the slot machine because you think the next pull will be a winner is an example of. 4, Question number 4, you consistently submit your chapter summaries to your instructor because you can earn 5 points for every 4 summaries submitted. This is an example of. Answer number 1 is fixed interval. Answer number 2 is variable interval. Answer number 3 is variable ratio. Answer number 4 is fixed ratio. Put your heads together. Imagine you are teaching math to 3rd grade students in your groups A. Imagine you are teaching math to 3rd grade students. In your groups A, explain how you would use each other. In your groups A, explain how you would use each of the 4 reinforcement schedules to increase the amount of time students study for math quizzes. B, describe how each schedule might affect student behavior. And C, predict the problem that could arise with each schedule. So far, we have learned about increasing behaviors through reinforcement. But sometimes we need to decrease behaviors. Let's turn our attention to techniques used for this purpose. In the doghouse, punishment. In contrast to reinforcement, which makes a behavior more likely to reoccur. In contrast to reinforcement, which makes a behavior more likely to recur, the goal of punishment is to decrease or stop a behavior. Infographic 5.4. Punishment accomplishes this by instilling an association between a behavior and some unwanted consequence. For example, between stealing and going to jail, or between misbehaving and loss of screen time. Punishment isn't always effective, as people are sometimes willing to accept unpleasant consequences to get something they really want. What kind of punishment? There are 2 major categories of punishment, positive and negative. With positive punishment, something aversive or disagreeable is applied following a target behavior. When children misbehave, some parents try to stop the undesirable behavior by spanking or striking a child on the bottom with an open hand, according to Gershoff, ETAL 2018, page 626. Spanking is a controversial form of positive punishment. While spanking may provide a quick fix for bad behavior, many researchers contend that it leads to more behavior problems in the long run, according to Gershoff, ETAL 2018. Other psychologists contend there is not adequate data to conclude a causal relationship exists, according to Larzalier, ETAL 2019. Survey data indicate that overwhelmingly psychologists are opposed to parental use of spanking, according to Miller, Perrin, and Rush, 2018, page 405. An alternative discipline strategy is to use time out from positive reinforcement. This approach is effective for addressing problematic behaviors that are within the child's control, as long as parents behave in a way that is consistent and fair and take steps to ensure the child feels secure and loved, according to Dad's and Tully, 2019. Honking drivers get punished. Police in Mumbai, India, came up with a creative way to discourage excessive honking during red lights. Yes, you read that correctly. Traffic is so bad in Mumbai that people routinely honk during red lights. As the post above explains, they installed technology that measured the collective honking noise from cars waiting at intersections. Every time the sound level reached 85 decibels, the red light would reset, making drivers wait all over again. According to Ellis Peterson, 2020, the purpose was to reduce an unwanted behavior, honking, through positive punishment, the addition of more wait time. Negative punishment also aims to reduce behaviors, but it involves taking away something pleasant or valuable. People who drive drunk run the risk of negative punishment, as their driver's license may be taken away. Show up late for class, and you may suffer the negative punishment of missing that day's lecture altogether, as your instructor may lock the door at the beginning of class. Their goal is to decrease the unwanted behavior of arriving late. LO13. Explain how punishment differs from negative reinforcement. Punishment versus negative reinforcement. Punishment and negative reinforcement are two concepts that students often find difficult to distinguish. Table 5.2, infographic 5.4. Remember that punishment, positive or negative, is designed to decrease the behavior that it follows, whereas reinforcement, positive or negative, aims to increase the behavior. Table 5.2, reinforcement versus punishment. Term, defined, goal, example. Positive reinforcement, addition of a stimulus, usually pleasant, following a target behavior, increase desired behavior. Students who complete an online course 15 days before the end of semester receive 10 points of extra credit. Negative reinforcement, removal of an unpleasant stimulus following a target behavior, increased desired behavior. Students with perfect attendance do not have to take weekly quizzes. Positive punishment, addition of something unpleasant following an unwanted behavior, decrease undesired behavior. Students who are late to class more than 2 times have to write an extra paper. Negative punishment, removal of something pleasant following an unwanted behavior, decrease undesired behavior. Students late to class on exam day are not allowed to use their notes when taking the exam. The positive and negative forms of reinforcement and punishment are easy to confuse. Above are some concrete definitions, goals, and examples to help you sort them out. If all the positives and negatives are confusing you, just think in terms of math. Positive always means adding something, and negative means taking it away. Punishment can be positive, which means in addition of something viewed as unpleasant because you made a mess of your room, you have to clean the toilets. Or negative, which involves the removal of something viewed as pleasant or valuable because you made a mess of your room, no ice cream for you. Infographic 5.4, learning, reinforcement, and punishment. Infographic 5.4, Learning, Reinforcement, and Punishment. Behavior, driving fast. You want to increase this behavior? Yes, it's NASCAR. You have to drive faster than anyone else to win. We will apply a reinforcer to increase the behavior. Reinforcement, negative reinforcement. You don't like working in the family auto body shop. Your family says you can work fewer hours if you win the next race. Taking away unwanted work increases the speeding behavior. Positive reinforcement. You win a trophy and a cash prize for going fast at the race. Adding desirable rewards increases your speeding behavior. No, we're not at the racetrack. Speeding is dangerous and against the law. We will apply a punishment to decrease the behavior. Punishment. Negative punishment. Your license is suspended. Taking away something desirable decreases your speeding behavior. Positive punishment. The police officer gives you a citation. Adding something undesirable decreases your speeding behavior. Test yourself. Which process matches each of the following examples? Choose from positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. 1. Carlos's parents grounded him the last time he stayed out past his curfew, so tonight he came home right on time. The answer is negative punishment. Question number 2. Ginny spent an entire week helping an elderly neighbor clean out their basement after a flood. The local newspaper caught wind of the story and ran it as an inspiring front page headline. Ginny enjoyed the attention and decided to organize a neighborhood work group. The answer is positive reinforcement. Question number 3. The trash stinks, so Sherry takes it out. Negative reinforcement. Question number 4. Gabrielle's assistant had a bad habit of showing up late for work, so Gabriel docked his pay. Question number 4. The answer for question number 4 is negative punishment. During food drives, the basketball team Question number 5. During food drives, the basketball team offers to wash your car for free if you donate 6 items or more to the local homeless shelter. Answer number 5 is positive reinforcement. Question number 6. Claire received a stern lecture from texting in class. She doesn't want to hear that again, so now she turns off her phone when she enters the classroom. The answer for question number 6 is positive punishment. Extended description for infographic 5.4, learning, reinforcement, and punishment. Career connections. Reinforcement is golden. Reinforcement is one of the most effective ways to change behaviors, but many people fail to take full advantage of its power. Would you believe that 37% of business managers report that they never offer positive reinforcement? Yet this type of input is key to maintaining good work relationships. Managers who offer positive reinforcement are actually perceived as more effective than those who provide mere criticism, according to Zenger and Folkman, 2017. What's more, workers tend to be more engaged when supervisors emphasize their strengths rather than homing in on their weaknesses, according to Fessler, 2017, Harder, and Atkins, 2015. Reinforcement also comes into play when we consider pro-social behaviors, acts of kindness in the workplace. When people demonstrate pro-social behaviors toward their colleagues, both parties benefit. The giver ends up feeling more satisfied with life, and the receiver is happier and more likely to demonstrate their own pro-social behaviors, according to Chancellor, ETAL 2018. Kindness reinforces kindness. As you can see, operant conditioning has far-ranging applications. Whether we are aware of it or not, our behaviors are constantly being shaped by reinforcement and punishment in the Treatment of Psychological Disorders chapter. In the Treatment of Psychological Disorders chapter, we discuss some of the ways therapists use operant conditioning to help clients develop healthier behaviors. We call this treatment approach behavior modification. As you may recall from Chapter 1, the 4 main goals of psychology are to describe, explain, predict, and change behavior. Can you see how behavior modification helps us achieve that 4th goal, to change behavior? Let's compare. Both operant and classical conditioning are forms of learning, and they share many common principles. Table 5.3, as with classical conditioning, behaviors learned through operant conditioning go through an acquisition phase. It takes a certain number of practice sessions for a dog to learn a new command, such as stay or down. Similarly, the cats in Thorndike's experiments learned how to escape their puzzle boxes after a series of trials. In both cases, the acquisition stage occurs gradually. Behaviors learned through operant conditioning are also subject to extinction. That is, they may fade in the absence of reinforcers. A rat in a Skinner box eventually gives up pushing on a lever if there is no longer a reinforcer awaiting. But that same lever pushing behavior can make a sudden comeback through spontaneous recovery. After a rest period, the rat returns to his box and reverts to his old lever pushing ways. Table 5.3, conditioning basics. Concept, classic conditioning, operant conditioning. The association links different stimuli, often through repeated pairings, links behaviors with consequences, often through repeated pairings. Response, involuntary behavior, voluntary behavior. Acquisition, the initial learning phase. Extinction, the disappearance of a conditioned response after repeated exposure to the conditioned stimulus in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. The disappearance of a learned behavior through the removal of its reinforcer. Concept, spontaneous recovery, classical conditioning, the reappearance of the conditioned response following its extinction. Operant conditioning, the reappearance of a learned behavior following its extinction. These fundamentals These fundamental learning concepts apply both classical and operant conditioning. Stimulus generalization and discrimination also occurs in operant conditioning. If a rat is conditioned to push a particular type of lever, it may push a variety of other lever types similar in shape, size, and color. Stimulus generalization. But that same rat may not push a button. It can differentiate between a button and a lever. Stimulus discrimination. Reptiles behave in the same way, according to Sizebel, ETAL 2021. For example, turtles can learn to discriminate among black, white, and gray paddles when given positive reinforcers, according to Morsels of Meat, Liti, ETAL 2013. Let's contrast. Students sometimes have trouble differentiating between classical and operant conditioning. Figure 5.3. After all, both forms of conditioning, classical and operant, involve forming associations. In classical conditioning, the learner links different stimuli. In operant conditioning, the learner connects their behavior to its consequences, reinforcement and punishment. But there are many key differences between classical and operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, the learned behaviors are involuntary or reflexive. Gavin, the ATF agent, could not directly control his shaking any more than Pavlov's dogs could decide when to salivate. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, concerns voluntary behavior. Caesar had power over his decision to work with problem dogs, just as Skinner's pigeons had control over swatting bowling balls with their beaks. In short, classical conditioning is an involuntary form of learning, whereas operant conditioning requires active effort. Another important distinction is the way in which behaviors are strengthened. In classical conditioning, behaviors become more established with repeated pairings of stimuli. The more often the sight of the golden arches is paired with the taste of French fries, the tighter the association between these stimuli. Recall the mouth-watering example from infographic 5.1. With operant conditioning, behaviors are also strengthened by repeated pairings, but the connection is between a behavior and its consequences. Reinforcers strengthen the behavior, punishment weakens it. The mere benefit reinforcers Caesar accrues by working with people and dogs, the greater the likelihood he will continue cultivating his career. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning. Classical conditioning. Involuntary learners, response is reflexive, nature of behavior. Operant conditioning, voluntary learner controls response. Classical conditioning, learn to link different stimuli. Association. Operant conditioning, learn to link behavior with consequence. Classical conditioning, through repeated pairing of stimuli, strengthening behavior. Operant conditioning, through repeated pairing of behavior and consequence. Extended description for figure 5.3, differences between classical and operant conditioning. 5.3, differences between classical and operant conditioning. In some cases, classical conditioning and operant conditioning occur simultaneously, according to Kim and Anderson 2021. Babies learn that they get fed when they cry. Getting formula or breast milk reinforces the crying behavior. Operant conditioning. Babies also learn to associate formula or breast milk with the appearance of the bottle or breast. The moment they see either, they begin salivating in anticipation of being fed. Classical conditioning. Classical and operant conditioning are not the only ways we learn. There is another major category of learning we have yet to cover. Use this hint to guess what it might be. How did you learn to cut an apple, brush your teeth, or throw a frisbee? Show what you know. Question number 1. A third grade teacher gives her students prizes for passing math tests. Not only do these students improve their math scores, they also begin studying harder for spelling tests. As a result of this reinforcement schedule, their increased studying of spelling is an example of A, classical conditioning, B, an unconditioned response, C, an unconditioned stimulus, or D, stimulus generalization. The answer is D, stimulus generalization. A third grade teacher gives her students prizes for passing math tests. Not only do the students improve their math scores, they also begin studying harder for spelling tests. As a result of this reinforcement schedule, their increased studying of spelling is an example of D, stimulus generalization. Question number 2. Think about a behavior you would like to change, either yours or someone else's. Devise a plan using positive and negative reinforcement. Question number 2. Think about a behavior you would like to change, either yours or someone else's. Devise a plan using positive and negative reinforcement to change that behavior. Also contemplate how you might use successive approximations. What primary and secondary reinforcers would you use? Answers will vary, but can be based on the following definitions. Reinforcers are consequences that increase the likelihood of a behavior recurring. Positive reinforcement is the process by which pleasant reinforcers are positive reinforcement is the process by which pleasant reinforcers are presented following a target behavior. Negative reinforcement occurs with the removal of an unpleasant stimulus. Negative reinforcement occurs with the removal of an unpleasant stimulus following a target behavior. Successive approximation is a method that uses reinforcers to condition a series of small steps that gradually approach the target behavior. We could consider using food as a primary reinforcer, meeting a biological need. Good grades or money are examples of secondary reinforcers. Question number 3. According to Thorndike's blank. Question number 3. Question number 3. According to Thorndike's blank, behaviors are more likely to be repeated when they are followed by pleasurable outcomes. The answer is law of effect. According to Thorndike's law of effect, behaviors are more likely to be repeated when they are followed by pleasurable outcomes. Question number 4. A child disrupts class and the teacher writes their name on the board. For the rest of the week, the child does not act up. The teacher used blank to decrease the child's disruptive behaviors. Is the answer A, positive punishment, B, negative punishment, C, positive reinforcement, or D, negative reinforcement? The answer is A, positive punishment. A child disrupts class and the teacher writes their name on the board. For the rest of the week, the child does not act up. The teacher used positive punishment to decrease the child's disruptive behaviors. Question number 5. How do continuous and partial reinforcement differ? Continuous reinforcement is a schedule of reinforcement in which every target behavior is reinforced. Partial reinforcement is a schedule of reinforcement Continuous reinforcement is a schedule of reinforcement in which every target behavior is reinforced. Partial reinforcement is a schedule of reinforcement in which target behaviors are reinforced intermittently, not continuously. Continuous reinforcement is generally more effective for establishing a behavior, whereas learning through partial reinforcement is more resistant to extinction and useful for maintaining behavior. Observational learning and cognition. Caesar's role models. Growing up in Mexico, Caesar's role models. Growing up in Mexico, Caesar loved watching reruns of the dog shows Lassie and the Adventure. Growing up in Mexico, Caesar loved watching reruns of the dog shows Lassie and the Adventures. Caesar's role models. Growing up in Mexico, Caesar loved watching reruns of the dog shows Lassie and the Adventures of Rin Tin Tin from the 1950s and 1960s. The dogs in these shows performed incredible physical and intellectual feats, behaviors young Caesar imagined were typical of all American dogs. Once in the United States, Caesar began searching for someone who could teach him the art of American dog training. You have to look for somebody with wisdom, Caesar says. That's what kept me going. But Caesar would eventually discover that his most important teachers were back in Mexico, and he had already learned from them. His grandfather, Teodoro, had taught him what it means to be a pack leader and how to interact effectively with dogs. He didn't talk much, but he demonstrated behaviors that Caesar could observe and imitate. Never work against Mother Nature, Teodoro would say, or you have to be calm. Then after stating these tenets, Teodoro would execute them, and the dogs would trot after him and perform his desired behaviors. On the ranch, left to right, Caesar's mother, grandmother, sister, cousin, grandfather, and Caesar on the family farm in Lixpalino. Many of the behaviors Caesar learned in childhood came from observing role models on the family farm. The ranch dogs also served as role models for young Caesar. From the time I was very little, I found joy in dogs simply by observing them Milan and Peltier, 2006, page 25. Caesar spent hours studying how the dogs interacted and adopted some of these behaviors himself. If you watch Caesar, meet a dog for the first time, you'll see he demonstrates no talk, no touch, no eye contact. According to Milan and Peltier, 2006, page 46. This is exactly how dogs greet one another with respect. Caesar's grandfather and the ranch dogs served as models, demonstrating behaviors that could be observed and imitated. Learning by watching and mimicking others is called observational learning. According to Bandura, 1986, observational learning is more likely to occur when learners 1. Pay attention to the model. 2. Remember what they observed, according to Barak et al. 2002. 3. Are capable of performing the observed behavior. And 4. Are motivated to demonstrate the behavior. What specific skills have you developed through observational learning? If you have ever used a how-to video on YouTube or TikTok, for example, how to unclog a drain or how to get six-pack abs, you are probably watching and imitating a model. Or perhaps someone has shown you how to change a flat tire, prepare an omelet, or perform CPR. All these skills can be acquired. With the help of observational learning. What about table manners? Remember how you learned those? Across the world, mind your manners. Travelers, be advised, eating etiquette can greatly differ from one culture to the next. Something as simple as eating with your left hand, which is commonplace in the United States, is considered unsanitary in India and in the Middle East, according to Bose-Camp, 2013. In Afghanistan and Korea, people sit down on the floor to eat a meal, according to Leontovich, 2016. But this is rarely done in France or Italy. Slurping noodles, generally viewed as ill-mannered in the United States, is interpreted as a sign of contentment in Japan, according to JapanGuide.com, 2020. Mexicans often eat with their hands, while Chileans use utensils for almost everything, including French fries, according to Bose-Camp, 2013. With or without utensils. Forks, knives, and spoons are customary in the United States, but people eat with their hands in many parts of the world. How one eats is a learned cultural behavior. Table manners are to some degree acquired through observational learning. Children observe family members using utensils, sipping from cups, and wiping their mouths with napkins, and then imitate these behaviors. Operant conditioning plays a role as well. You can imagine a child being reprimanded punishment for resting their feet on the table or shouting in a restaurant, or praised reinforcement for sitting up straight and saying please and thank you. You can imagine a child being reprimanded punishment for resting their feet on the table or shouting in a restaurant, or praised reinforcement for sitting up straight and saying please and thank you. Think about the manners you acquired growing up. How did you learn them, and what role did your culture play? Monkey see, monkey do. LO14. Summarize what Bandura's classic Bobo doll study teaches about learning. Just as observational learning can lead to positive outcomes, Caesar adopting the ways of his grandfather or children, learning manners, it can also breed undesirable behaviors. The classic Bobo doll experiment by U.S. psychologist Albert Bandura, 1925 through 2021, and his colleagues reveals just how fast children can adopt aggressive ways they see modeled by adults, as well as exhibit their own classic Bobo doll experiment by U.S. psychologist Albert Bandura, 1925 through 2021, and his colleagues reveals just how fast children can adopt aggressive ways they see modeled by adults, as well as exhibit their own novel aggressive responses, according to Bandura et al. 1961. In one of Bandura's studies, 76 preschool children were placed in a room one at a time with an adult. In one of Bandura's studies, 76 preschool children were placed in a room one at a time with an adult. Some of the children were paired with adults who acted aggressively toward a 5-foot-tall inflatable Bobo doll, punching it in the nose, hitting its head with a mallet, kicking it around the room, and yelling phrases such as "sock him in the nose" and "pow." The other children in the study were paired with adults who played with toys peacefully, according to Bandura et al. 1961. At the end of the experiment, all the children were allowed to play with a Bobo doll. At the end of the experiment, all the children were allowed to play with a Bobo doll themselves. Those who had observed adults attacking and shouting were much more likely to do the same. Boys were more likely than girls to mimic physical aggression, especially if they had observed it modeled by men. And boys and girls were about equally likely to imitate verbal aggression, according to Bandura et al. 1961. Extended description for Bobo doll. Bobo doll preschool children in Albert Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiment performed shocking displays of aggression after seeing such behaviors modeled by adults. The children were more likely to copy models who were rewarded for their aggressive behavior and less likely to mimic those who were punished, according to Bandura 1986. Try this. Identify the independent variable and dependent variable in the experiment by Bandura and colleagues. What might you change if you were to replicate this experiment? Independent variable, exposure to an adult displaying aggressive or non-aggressive behavior. Dependent variable, child's level of aggression. Ideas for altering the study: conducting the same study with younger children, exposing the children to other children as opposed to adults behaving aggressively, pairing children with adults of the same and different ethnicities to determine the impact of ethnic background. Think critically. Do kids learn aggression from media? Psychologists have followed up on Bandura's research with studies investigating how children and adults are influenced by violence they see in the media. Much of the focus has been violent video games, whose use has been associated with decreases in helping behaviors and increases in problematic behaviors and increases in Much of the focus has been on violent video games, whose use has been associated with decreases in helping behaviors. Much of the focus has been on violent video games whose use has been associated with decreases in helping behaviors and increases in problematic behaviors, including aggression, according to Coiney, ETAL 2018, and Prescott, ETAL 2018. A comprehensive literature review and meta-analysis by the American Psychological Association APA Task Force on Violent Media arrived at this conclusion. The use of violent video games results in increases in overall aggression, as well as increases in the individual variables of aggressive behaviors, aggressive cognitions, aggressive affect, desensitization, physiological arousal, and decreases in empathy, according to Calvert, ETAL 2017, page 142. These findings apply to older kids, teens, and young adults, as studies of children younger than 10 are lacking. It is also worth noting that the APA task force did not uncover a link between exposure to violent video games and criminal activities. Yes.
Last name?
Fouad, F-O-U-A-D.
First name?
Omar.
Date of birth?
December 14th, 1988.
Yeah, 4 ready for you today.
Thank you, Alexis. Is that Lillian back there?
Yes.
Hi, Lillian.
Okay, and the mouthwash is not covered. It's $10.
I don't have enough money for it.
Yeah.
It is also worth noting that the APA task force did not uncover a link between exposure to violent video games and criminal activities, according to Calvert, ETAL 2017. Research connections. In Chapter 1, we discussed some of the limitations of correlation research. Studies may uncover correlations between media violence and aggression, but that doesn't prove a cause and effect relationship. There could be a third variable influencing both media exposure and aggression. Perhaps parents who allow their children to use violent media are also more likely to model aggressive behaviors their children might imitate. Some scholars are not convinced there is a cause and effect relationship between violent video games and aggression. They contend many studies on the topic are methodologically flawed. They contend many studies on the topic are methodologically flawed and provide evidence indicating that the links between these variables are negligible, according to Ferguson 2015, Ferguson ETAL 2020, Przybliski, and Weinstein 2019. But these scholars in turn have been criticized for their own methods, according to Bushman and Anderson 2023. Confusing matters further.
If we can come to this last one, the parents has a quick question for you. Hope you have a nice day, sir.
Same with you. Stay strong and you take care of yourself. It's good to see you again. Confusing matters further. The results of different meta-analysis appear to contradict one another. A meta-analysis is a statistical approach researchers use to combine the results of different studies and draw general conclusions. Searching for some area of agreement in the meta-analysis wars, one group of researchers reanalyzed the data from 3 notable studies and reported the following. Despite seemingly conflicting results, all of the meta-analysis do, in fact, point to the conclusion that in the vast majority of settings, violent video games do increase aggressive behavior, but that these effects are most, despite seemingly conflicting results,
All of the meta-analysis do in fact point to the conclusion that in the vast majority of settings, violent video games do increase aggressive behavior, but that these effects are almost always quite small. According to Mather and Vanderweel, 2019, page 705. The research on video games and aggression is ongoing, and we should follow it closely. As we do, it is important to keep in mind that media violence is one of many variables that might play a role in the development of aggression. According to Anderson et al. 2017, other environmental factors such as abuse and exposure to trauma are also established risk factors. We must consider the role of heredity too. Childhood aggression is partly explained by genes with heritability estimates ranging from 50% to 68% according to IP et al. 2021, Luke K. et al. 2018, Provencal et al. 2015. In other words, aggressive behavior may run in families. Like any psychological phenomenon, aggression is shaped by a complex and ongoing interaction of nature and nurture. Given what we do and don't know about violent media and aggression, what practical steps should parents and caregivers take to promote children's well-being? First,
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing strong. I hope you're doing the same.
I'm doing well. Okay, you have, it's really just on your clobetasol solution that you apply to the scalp once a day for itching and irritation. Okay, it's a liquid, so you can just drop it right onto the areas and then just massage it in your scalp. Okay. Do you have any questions?
The clindamycin pleasure wipes. Is there a refill I could get on those?
Yeah, I got 3.
3? Thank you, sir.
There's 3 on it. On the ketoconazole shampoo, you got 2 on it. And you got 3 on this.
Thank you, Mr. Durrell.
Okay. You're welcome.
Is there anything I could do for you?
I'm doing good. All right.
Stay strong.
Thank
Take
you.
care of yourself.
All right, you too.
Given what we do and don't know about violent media and aggression, what practical steps should parents and caregivers take? Given what we do and don't know about violent media and aggression, what practical steps should parents and caregivers take to promote children's well-being? First, they should consider the positive impact of sending children outdoors to play. It improves their sleep, health, and social well-being, according to XU ETAL 2016 and Yagman ETAL 2018. When kids do consume electronic media, adults can set time limits. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends minimal screen time for children under the age of 2, no more than 1 hour per day for preschoolers, and parental supervision for all age groups. According to American Academy of Pediatrics, 2016A, 2016B. Unfortunately, children and their parents have not followed these guidelines. The average American child spends 7 hours per day watching TV and using tablets, smartphones, and other electronic media. According to American Academy of Pediatrics, ND, in addition to setting limits on screen time, parents and caregivers should consider media content. Not all media are violent, and some confer psychological benefits. For example, action video games that require 3D navigation, quick shifts in attention, and other skills may improve perceptual abilities, according to Green and Bavalier, 2015, while some TV shows and mobile apps encourage pro-social behaviors, according to Christekes, ETAL 2013, and E.E. Rasmussen, ETAL 2019. Learning to be nice. Pro-social behaviors are actions that are kind, generous, and beneficial to others, and people can pick them up by observing models. According to Jung, ETAL 2020, some mobile apps learning to be nice. Pro-social behaviors are actions that are kind, generous, and beneficial to others, and people can pick them up by observing models. According to Jung, ETAL 2020, some mobile apps and TV shows like Sesame Street can encourage pro-social behaviors in children. According to Cole, ETAL 2008, and Flynn, ETAL 2019. In fact, Sesame Street is the only show specifically mentioned in the American Academy of Pediatrics 2016A policy statement on media and young minds. Well-designed television programs such as Sesame Street can improve cognitive literacy and social outcomes for children 3 to 5 years of age. Page 2. In one study, researchers had parents changing the television shows their preschoolers were viewing, substituting aggression-laden programming with high-quality pro-social and educational programming. According to Christekes, ETAL 2013, page 431, when assessed 6 and 12 months after the intervention, the children who had switched to pro-social and educational programming showed more behavioral improvement than those in the control group. This effect was pronounced for boys from low-income households. According to Christekes, ETAL 2013, perhaps the pro-social messages of shows like Dora the Explorer and Super Y had made a difference. Let them play. One of the best ways for children to learn pro-social behaviors is by playing. When children play, they learn how to work together, negotiate rules, and resolve conflict. Social skills, which are part of playful learning, enable children to listen to directions, pay attention. When children play, they learn how to work together, negotiate rules, and resolve conflict. Social skills, which are part of playful learning, enable children to listen to directions, pay attention, solve disputes with words, and focus on tasks without constant supervision. All of which are critical for success in school and beyond, according to Yogman, ETAL 2018, page 2. Environmental forces can push adults to adopt pro-social behaviors as well. Consider the example of wearing face masks, which have been shown to reduce the transmission of environmental forces can push adults to adopt pro-social behaviors as well. Consider the example of wearing face masks, which have been shown to reduce the transmission of the novel coronavirus and therefore save lives, according to CHU ETAL 2020, Eikenberry, ETAL 2020. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, people around the world changed their behaviors to stop the virus from spreading. Learning collectively helps groups to achieve what no one individual can, according to Schittenberg, ETAL 2020, page 927. Latent learning. Earlier, we pointed out that Caesar focuses on rehabilitating dogs and training people. When did his unique philosophy take form? After moving to Los Angeles, Caesar began working at a dog training facility where he awed coworkers with his ability to placate out of control dogs. His approach was simple. If he noticed a dog was afraid or on edge, he would quietly open the door, avoid eye contact, turn his back, and allow the dog to come to him. Unconsciously, I was beginning to apply the dog psychology I had learned from my years observing dogs on my grandfather's farm. Caesar writes, I was interacting with the dogs the way they interacted with one another, according to Milan and Peltier 2006, page 47. Could this be an example of latent learning? LO15 described latent learning and explained how cognition is involved in learning. Latent learning is a type of learning that occurs without awareness and regardless of reinforcement, and is not evident until there is a need to use it. You experience latent learning all the time. For example, anytime you explore a New York, you experience latent learning all the time. For example, anytime you explore a new park, neighborhood, or shopping mall, you are unconsciously gathering data from your senses. Sights, sounds, smells, touch, and perhaps even taste if you stop for a bite to eat. Rats that know where to go. U.S. psychologist Edward Tolman, 1886 through 1959, and his colleague C.H. Hanzik, 1897 through C.A. 1968, demonstrated latent learning in rats in their classic 1930 maze experiment, figure 5.4. The researchers took 3 groups of rats and let them run free in mazes for several days. One group received food for reaching the goal boxes in their maze. One group received food for reaching the goal boxes in their mazes. A second group received no reinforcement, and a third group received nothing until the 11th day of the experiment, when they too, one group received food for researching the goal boxes in their mazes. A second group received no reinforcement, and a third group received nothing until the 11th day of the experiment, when they too received food after finding the goal box. As you might expect, rats getting the treats from the onset solved the mazes more quickly as the days were on. Meanwhile, their unrewarded compatriots wandered through the twists and turns. But on day 11, when the researchers started to give treats to the third group of rats, their behavior changed markedly. After just one round of treats, the rats were scurrying through the mazes and scooping up the food as if they had been rewarded throughout the experiments. According to Tolman and Hanzik, 1930. They had apparently been learning even when there was no reinforcement for doing so, or in simpler terms, learning just for the sake of learning. Error rate, days. No reinforcement, continuous reinforcement. Reinforcement begins on day 11. Extended description for figure 5.4, latent learning. Figure 5.4, latent learning. In a classic experiment, groups of rats learned how to navigate a maze at remarkably different rates. In a classic experiment, groups of rats learned how to navigate a maze at remarkably different rates. Rats in a group receiving reinforcement from day one, the green line on the graph, initially had the lowest rate of errors and were able to work their way through the maze more quickly than the other groups. But when a group began to receive reinforcement for the first day, when a group began to receive reinforcement for the first time on day 11, the blue line, their error rate dropped immediately. This shows that the rats were learning the basic structure of the maze even when they weren't being reinforced. Information from Tolman, 1948. A map that cannot be seen. Like Tolman's rats, we remember locations, objects, and details of our surroundings without realizing it, and bring this information together in a mental layout. According to Lynch, 1960, this latent learning is evident in our ability to form cognitive maps or mental representations of the physical surroundings. Research suggests that visually impaired people forge cognitive maps without the use of visual information. Instead, they use compensatory sensorial channels. Hearing and sense of touch, for example. Instead, they use compensatory sensorial channels. Hearing and sense of touch, for example, to gather information about their environments, according to LaHave and Mioduser, 2008. The brain processes that enable cognitive map making may help us form social maps too. Social maps help us understand where people fit into hierarchies and how close they are to others. Good friends versus acquaintances, for example, according to Schaefer and Schiller, 2020. Bats from cognitive maps too. Egyptian fruit bats travel through areas as large as 1,000 square kilometers or 386 square miles to forage from fruit trees. Egyptian fruit bats travel through areas as large as 1,000 square kilometers or 386 square miles to forage from fruit trees. The movement of these animals does not appear to be random. They make goal-directed trips and often take shortcuts, evidence that they form cognitive maps of their territories, according to Toledo ETAL 2020. Studies on latent learning and cognitive maps focus on the cognitive processes underlying behavior, and their findings suggest that learning can occur in the absence of reinforcement. This emphasis on cognition conflicts with the strict form of behaviorism endorsed by Skinner and some other 20th century psychologists. Many other studies have challenged the behaviorist notion that all behaviors and mental processes are determined by forces in the environment. For example, German psychologist Wolfgang Kohler, 1887 through 1967, found evidence that chimpanzees are capable of thinking through a problem before taking action. Kohler designed an experiment in which chimps were presented with out-of-reach bananas and showed that the animals were able to plan a variety of banana fetching strategies, including stacking crates to climb on. 1925. The chimps were displaying insight, a sudden coming together of awareness of a situation, leading to the solution of a problem, cognition, language, and intelligence chapter, according to Labor, Warren, 2022. Like latent learning, insight can occur in the absence of reinforcement. Today, most psychologists agree that both observable, measurable behaviors and internal cognitive processes such as insight are necessary and complementary elements of learning. Environmental factors have a powerful influence on behavior, as Pavlov, Skinner, and others discovered, but every action can be traced to activity in the brain. Understanding how cognitive processes translate to behaviors remains one of the greatest challenges facing psychologists. You are a valuable member of the pack. The time has come to wrap up this chapter on learning, but first, let's take one Cesar Millan. The time has come to wrap up this chapter on learning, but first, let's take one more opportunity to learn something from Cesar Millan. Imagine you could sit down and talk with Cesar. What advice might you offer? What advice might he offer about lifelong learning and career goals? Each of us plays a unique and important role in society, or the human pack, as Cesar might describe it. I see that we're all part of a pack, Cesar explains. You have to find your place in the pack, and once you find your place in the pack, you serve a big purpose. Some of us are leaders, others are not, but every pack member has equal value. What would Cesar say to those of us still struggling to find our place in the pack or purpose in life? It may sound like a platitude, but find your passion. Figure out what makes you happy and pursue a path that allows you to nurture it. Once you find your passion, you don't think you're working, Cesar says. Indeed, research suggests that people who are satisfied at work often feel more satisfied in their personal lives, according to Allen and McCarthy, 2016. If you ever find yourself lost, focus your energy on learning. I think the listening is more powerful than anything else. Cesar explains, when you're lost, when you're sad, you have to ask questions. In other words, learning should be a continuous, lifelong activity. Sharing his love. Cesar presents to an audience in Berlin, Germany. It has now been more than 3 decades since this celebrated dog trainer illegally crossed the border into the United States. And although he became a U.S. citizen in 2009, Cesar really views himself as a citizen of the world. I belong to a worldwide community of people who love dogs, he writes. This is my pack. Milan, 2013, page 12. Video profile. Cesar, you asked, they answered. Show what you know. Question number 1. Bandura's Bobo doll shows us that observational learning results in a wide variety of learned behaviors. Describe several types of behaviors you have learned by observing others. Answers will vary, but can be based on the following definitions. A model is an individual or character whose behavior is being imitated. Observational learning occurs as a result of watching the behavior of others. Question number 2. You want to learn how to play basketball, so you watch videos of Stephen Curry executing plays. If your game improves as a result, this would be considered an example of A, observational learning, B, association, C, pro-social behavior, D, your cognitive map. The answer is A, observational learning. You want to learn how to play basketball, so you watch videos of Stephen Curry executing plays. If your game improves as a result, this would be considered an example of observational learning. Question number 3. Although Skinner believed that reinforcement is the cause of learning, there is robust evidence that reinforcement is not always necessary. This comes from experiments studying A, positive reinforcement, B, negative reinforcement, C, latent learning, D, stimulus generalization. The answer is C, latent learning. Although Skinner believed that reinforcement is the cause of learning, there is robust evidence that reinforcement is not always necessary. This comes from experiments studying latent learning. Chapter 5 review. Summary of concepts. LO1, define learning. Learning is a relatively enduring change in behavior or thinking that results from experiences. Organisms as simple as sea slugs, and as complex as humans have the ability to learn. Learning is about creating associations. Sometimes we associate two different stimuli, classical conditioning. Other times we make connections between our behaviors and their consequences, operant conditioning. We can also learn by watching and imitating others, observational learning, creating a link between our behavior and the behavior of others. LO2, explain what Pavlov's studies teach us about classical conditioning. The dogs in Pavlov's studies learned to link various stimuli with the arrival of food, which caused them to salivate when the stimuli were introduced. He discovered that associations develop through a learning process now referred to as classical conditioning. With classical conditioning, two stimuli become associated. Once this association has been established, an originally neutral stimulus elicits an involuntary response. LO3, identify the differences between the US, UR, CS, and CR. In classical conditioning, a neutral stimulus, NS, is something in the environment that does not normally cause a relevant, automatic, or reflexive response. The neutral stimulus, NS, is repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus, US, that triggers an unconditioned response, UR. During this process of acquisition, the neutral stimulus, NS, becomes a conditioned stimulus, CS, that elicits a conditioned response, CR. In Pavlov's experiments with dogs, the neutral stimulus, NS, might have been the sound of a buzzer. The unconditioned stimulus, US, was the meat, and the unconditioned response, UR, was the dog's salivation. After repeated pairings with the meat, the buzzer, originally a neutral stimulus, became a conditioned stimulus, CS, eliciting the conditioned response, CR, of salivation, a learned behavior. LO4, recognize and give examples of stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Once conditioning has occurred and the conditioned stimulus CS elicits the conditioned response CR, the learner may respond to similar stimuli as if they were the original CS. This is called stimulus generalization. For example, someone who has been bitten by a small dog and reacts with fear to all dogs, big and small, demonstrates stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is the ability to differentiate between a conditioned stimulus, CS, and other stimuli sufficiently different from it. Someone who is bitten by a small dog may have a fear reaction to small dogs, but not large dogs, thus demonstrating stimulus discrimination. LO5, summarize how classical conditioning is dependent on the biology of the organism. Animals and people show biological preparedness, meaning they are predisposed to learn associations. They have adapted value. Animals and people show biological preparedness, meaning they are predisposed to learn associations that have adaptive value. For example, conditioned taste aversion is a form of classical conditioning that occurs when an organism learns to associate the taste of a particular food or drink with illness. Avoiding foods that induce sickness increases the odds the organism will survive and reproduce, passing its genes along to the next generation. LO6, describe the Little Albert study and explain how fear can be learned. The case study of Little Albert illustrates the conditioned emotional response, an emotional reaction, fear in Little Albert's case, acquired via classical conditioning. When Little Albert heard a loud bang, an unconditioned stimulus, he exhibited a fear response, unconditioned response, through conditioning. The sight of a rat became paired with the loud noise and went from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, CS. Little Albert's fear of the rat was a conditioned response, CR. LO7, describe Thorndike's law of effect. Thorndike's law of effect was important to the study of operant conditioning, a type of learning in which people or animals come to associate their voluntary actions with consequences. The law of effect states that if a behavior is followed by a pleasurable outcome, that behavior is more likely to recur. Thorndike's cats learned that if they escaped the puzzle box, they would get to eat fish. This increased the speed with which they opened the puzzle box. LO8, explain how positive and negative reinforcement differ. Positive reinforcement is a process by which reinforcers are presented following a target behavior. The addition of these reinforcers, which generally are pleasant stimuli, increases the likelihood of the behavior reoccurring. The addition of these reinforcers, which generally are pleasant stimuli, increases the likelihood of the behavior recurring. The fish treats Thorndike gave his cats are examples of positive reinforcers. They increase the likelihood of the cats opening the latch. Behaviors can also increase in response to negative reinforcement or the removal of something unpleasant. Putting on a seatbelt to stop an annoying beep is an example of negative reinforcement. It increases the likelihood of wearing a seatbelt. Both positive and negative reinforcement increase desired behaviors. LO9, distinguish between primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers satisfy biological needs, food, water, and physical contact, are considered primary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcers do not satisfy biological needs, but often derive their power from their connection with primary reinforcers. Money is an example of a secondary reinforcer. Money is an example of a secondary reinforcer. We know from experience that it gives us access to primary reinforcers such as food, a safe place to live, and perhaps even the ability to attract desirable mates. LO10, explain shaping and the method of successive approximations. Building on Thorndike's law of effect and Watson's behaviorism, Skinner used shaping through successive approximations, small steps leading to a desired behavior, to mold the behavior of animals. With shaping, a person observes the behaviors of animals, providing reinforcers when they perform at a required level. Animal behavior can be shaped using successive approximations, but instinct can interfere with the process. Instinctive drift is the tendency for animals to revert to instinctual behaviors after a behavior pattern has been learned. LO11, describe continuous reinforcement and partial reinforcement. Reinforcers can be delivered on a constant basis, continuous reinforcement or intermittently partial reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is generally more effective for establishing a behavior, whereas learning through partial reinforcement is more resistant to extinction, the partial reinforcement effect. LO12, name the schedules of reinforcement and give examples of each. In a fixed ratio schedule, reinforcement follows a preset number of desired responses or behaviors. In a variable ratio schedule, reinforcement follows a certain number of desired responses or behaviors, but the number changes across trials, fluctuating around a pre-calculated average. In a fixed interval schedule, reinforcement comes after a pre-established interval of time. The response or behavior is only reinforced after the interval passes. In a variable interval schedule, the reinforcement comes after an interval of time passes, but the length of the interval changes from trial to trial. LO13, explain how punishment differs from negative reinforcement. In contrast to reinforcement, which makes a behavior more likely to recur, the goal of punishment is to decrease a behavior. Negative reinforcement strengthens a behavior that it follows by removing something aversive or disagreeable. Punishment decreases a behavior by instilling an association between a behavior and some unwanted consequence. For example, between stealing and going to jail, or between misbehaving and loss of screen time. LO14, summarize what Bandura's classic Bobo doll study teaches us about learning. Observational learning can occur when we match. Observational learning can occur when we watch a model demonstrated behavior. Albert Bandura's classic Bobo doll experiment showed that children readily imitate aggression when they see it modeled by adults. Studies suggest that children and adults may be inclined to mimic aggressive behaviors portrayed in the media. Observation of pro-social behaviors, on the other hand, can encourage kindness, generosity, and additional forms of behavior that benefit others. LO15, describe latent learning and explain how cognition is involved in learning. Learning can occur without reinforcement. Edward Tolman showed that rats could learn to navigate mazes even when given no rewards. Their learning only became apparent when it was needed, latent learning. The rats were learning without reinforcement just for the sake of learning. To fully understand learning, we must study both measurable behaviors and cognitive processes. Key terms: acquisition, adaptive value, biological preparedness, classical conditioning, cognitive map, conditioned emotional response, conditioned response, CR, conditioned stimulus, CS, conditioned taste aversion, continuous reinforcement, extinction, fixed interval schedule, fixed ratio schedule, habituation, higher order conditioning, instinctive drift, latent learning, law of effect, learning model, negative punishment, negative reinforcement, neutral stimulus, NS, observational learning, operant conditioning, partial reinforcement effect, positive punishment, positive reinforcement, primary reinforcer, pro-social behaviors, punishment, reinforcement, reinforcer, secondary reinforcer, shaping, spontaneous recovery, stimulus discrimination, stimulus generalization, successive approximations, unconditioned response, UR, unconditioned stimulus, US, variable interval schedule, variable ratio schedule. Chapter 6, memory. Time now is 7:06 p.m. Today is Saturday, June 13th, 2026. I literally just arrived home as soon as I finished reading chapter 5. Subhanallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.